Good morning, my loverlies. Let's get started early here. And I'm eager. Let's get into the finishing up of The Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis. It's been long neglected now. We've been doing too many other things. So let's start with some slides to remind ourselves of what we've been reading and what this book's all about. And then we'll try to see if we can read the rest of it today. But first, get your coffee or your orange juice or your morning beverage. Your cup, your mug, your glass, your tankard, your chalice, your thermos, your stein, your canteen jug or flask, your vessel of any kind filled with your favorite liquid. Join me now. Unparalleled pleasure, dopamine hit of the day, thing that makes everything better. Simultaneous sip. Ooh, so much better with friends. Now, we've been reading this amazing book by C.S. Lewis. He's using literary analysis. So he's going to look at random obscure poems, epic poems, things that you've never heard of, things that everybody's heard of, literary works, mostly the former, actually, mostly stuff that people haven't read, that were appreciated by the layman in medieval times and Renaissance times and classical and transitional period times to say, okay, what did these people, these ancients and these medievals think about the cosmos? We've been reading Plutarch. Last night we read Numa. Geocentricity was not what they thought. The stars were not smaller than the Earth; they dwarfed the Earth. They were globes. Everybody knew all of these things physically, but in their astrophysics, they understood that, and yet they had a cosmology, which was a different subject. It was more like a story that you could hold in your mind at the same time as all that astrophysics, a story that told you about your relationship to divine matters and your place in the cosmos as a whole. And so what C.S. Lewis is going to do is say, okay, let's look at the literature, the poems, and let's see what that tells us about what the persons felt who were just the laypersons. Okay, we've got the scientific advancements. How much of that trickled down to the average person? Well, if it's in the poem and they're resonating with the poem, then it must have. And also, how much of Platonism or Aristotelianism, and we can get an idea of their cosmology and his. So that's his approach. And then his thesis is, I started doing this. I started studying the medievals, and he's going to effortlessly quote all this poetry to help us understand how they thought. And he says, what I've discovered is that medieval man was engaged in a really interesting civilizational project. Basically, it seems to him that if they discovered anything in writing, whether, excuse me, I'm sorry, we got to fix this. Whether it came from, Judeo sources or Germanic sources or pagan sources, if it was Platonic or Aristotelian, if it came from Arabic sources, if it was written down, it was difficult for medieval man to imagine that it was completely false, right? There's got to be some truth. I mean, why did we write it down? That sort of a thing. And so what he says is that as an entire culture, what they engaged in doing, without knowing it, maybe was a project of ordering and making sense out of all of these disparate sources so that they could make them logically consistent. So let's see. Um, this is again, it's through the lens of literature. So he's going to study literature and he's also going to introduce us to medieval literature that we might appreciate it better. He wants to discover how the medievals thought about the cosmos. Look at the poetry, which they relied upon those metaphors and concepts to resonate with the average layperson in order to catch on. Say, okay, these poems are popular. These are the ones that people were quoting and laughing about and reading together. What what do they say? Do they say the earth is round? Do they say, how are they understanding themselves through that lens? Okay. We already mentioned that there's a difference between astrophysics and cosmology. So this book was, we had said before, created on many lectures that were given at Oxford multiple times, and then people were like, "Yo, put this into a book." So he did. We will do this so that we can understand the cosmology of the medievals through their poetry, and so that we can begin to enjoy their poetry better if we wish to think about, like, okay, what did this mean to them and what was it trying to say to an audience? And now I can have the ears of that audience and I could appreciate the poetry that way rather than just saying, well, I'm from an alien culture and I'm reading the words, they have an effect on me. It's like, okay, but was that anything like the effect that they were going to have? Okay, so what he theorizes is that medieval man was engaged in the creation of what he calls a model. Many primitive ideas had by medievals, but they arrive at these ideas in a very different way than primitive man had arrived at them. So he comes up with this description of primitive man is just sort of dealing with nature, dealing with the divine, dealing with whatever forces are in his environment and trying to figure out life. And so there's stories, there's events, there's oral tradition, there's the development of theological, maybe philosophical ideas that get passed on, and primitive man is just living in those waters. He's swimming in those waters, and those are the ideas. No matter where he's coming from, we're just sort of out of the ground of history and events that happen within that isolated culture. Come some sort of understanding of who we are and what deities to worry about or to care for, or spirits that might live in the woods. You might have different theologies that emerge, but they emerge just sort of isolated with you. And he says, and then there's another type of culture which is just like that, but given enough time, maybe with a few interactions from alternative ways of thinking, a few trade routes or battles and wars with some neighboring tribes, and but mostly just you remain isolated and undisturbed. You can end up having in-house arguments and you can actually develop rigorous philosophy out of that. And it's all growing out of this one cultural source. He says medieval man was not either of those two. He wasn't the first and he wasn't the second. Medieval man was a different idea. For him, what medieval man was, and this needs to be updated, so the slide isn't right here. But medieval man was something totally different. He was a scholarly academic culture. What he had was 8 different libraries from 8 different cultural sources, and he was trying to, like, categorize all these ideas and make them make sense with each other because they came from very different sources. And he says, and one of the sources that mattered to medieval man was a culture that did the exact same thing. So he's saying, like, okay, this is an academic culture that is trying to make sense of written words that they're adopting from sophisticated cultures that grew out of sort of their own less disturbed origins. Okay, so that's his thesis, and we know his method. Let's remind ourselves what we've read already. Wish I could make this larger. This would make reading it easier. There we go. The best way to understand the Middle Ages were defined culturally like this: an island or continent of many people who had access to 8 libraries of varied other cultures, regarding the text of those books as essentially authoritative, tried to build a model which could incorporate all those truths. All right, just let's order and make sense out of all of these things. All right, so we drew some pictures of these ideas. I mean, this is just me paraphrasing. This is not like the words of C.S. Lewis here, but this is the idea he's expressing here. So again, just imagine you're trapped on an island and with 250,000 people that you don't know, none of you know each other, and you're discovering that there's 8 big libraries. There's the Tehranian library, there's the Athenian library, there's the, you can make it up whatever you want. If you were like medieval culture, you would be trying to make sense out of these texts. That's what they decided to do. Okay, many varied sources, some of them themselves the product of compilation civilization, like the Roman medievals were compelled to organize, is what he's saying. compelled to organize. So here's his thesis: medieval culture and literature can best be understood as a centuries long attempt to develop and refine a model of the world which can incorporate all the truths they think they found from these varied cultural sources. I just realized that I forgot to put out the link to join us. We're going to try to finish the discarded image today. And so we're reading the slides. If you're watching on X, I'm going to add a link where you can join on camera here if you want. Okay. Incorporate all the truths they think they found from these varied cultural sources. Seemingly contradictory sources have to be sorted out and tidied up, right? As we've seen already, the ancients, the medievals, they had, oh, hey, we're going to get into it right now. They had all sorts of sophisticated ideas. Logical consistency was certainly around. Um, but we're going to learn what saving appearances mean. You know, today we think of it as, hey, I don't want to look bad. Saving appearances was a medieval understanding. Man, pardon me. If you have a theory of the world, it better not be contradicted by anything we can observe. That's what saving appearances means. Anything that appears to us from any perspective has to be taken into account by any of your theories or we chuck it out. Yeah, that's what saving appearances means. All right. On the literary level, ideas which have been overthrown on the academic level may live on and be evident so in their poetry, right? Obviously. You could say, hey, we live in a Christian culture, but if all of our movies are about Zeus, you say, well, I'm not saying they're worshiping Zeus, but the ideas are still around and they're paying attention to them and they matter, right? Okay. On a scientific level, the medievals might say, oh, the earth is flat. They don't say that, obviously. But if all of their poetry talks about the circular globe of the spinning world, you say, well, I'm not sure they believed it was flat. The idea that it was round certainly resonated with them. All right, that's a bad example. I mean, it's not a bad example unless you think it's actually reflective of the medievals. But that's just to illustrate the idea. Okay, so he's going to say, look, I'm not gonna say, "What did the latest expert say in 1453 about this matter?" He's gonna say, "What was the poetry that was going on a century before and a century after, and how were people looking at the world?" I'm gonna use literature as the lens for understanding how medieval man thought. Literary, available and meaningful to the layman, cosmology, different sort of story one gets from astrophysics. We've already talked about this. Okay, so we've got this relationship. I wish I had a pointer. Is there a pointer? Nah. Okay, so we've got experts and laypersons, and there's going to be communication in both directions on that one. Um, you've got the experts who have the accepted consensus regarding our most developed thoughts on a topic, and then you have the laypersons who are interacting with and appreciating and giving life to uh, poetry that they like, and letting other stuff die that doesn't strike their fancy so much. So he's going to go down to this literary level and say, okay, let's do this investigation this way. There's ideas in poetry available and appreciated at the time. They draw from above, but they also discard ideas expounded by the experts and an interpretation of the meaning for us as humans of the ideas about the world which were and are espoused by experts. So they're going to be drawing from those expert ideas, but they're also going to say, okay, how about this idea? I like it better. And the laypersons, they're primarily just going to be interacting directly with that literature. So that's what we're concerned with. What did the medieval man think, and how did he think? All right. First thing is your theory has to make sense to of all observed phenomena. The medievals understood very well how to think like this, and they did. And further, they simplified by accepting the theories which explained everything and which didn't posit entities without cause. So they had saving appearances and Occam's razor at their disposal, and they all just referenced that as if everybody knew what that meant. And while they were trying to organize and make sense of all these varied sources, they had to have theories that took into account everything that could be observed everything that was observed. If you say, "Hey, I observed this, that doesn't fit your model," they would throw out the model rather than say, "Well, don't talk to me about that." And they said, "Look, we don't know that this is correct, but we know that it's simpler than the other story that also saves all the appearances, and so we're going to go with the simpler one for now until we have to." A story about um, what story means. Oh, sorry. But a story about what that story means for us and our understanding of ourselves is quite a different thing. Okay, right? So they knew how to think scientifically, and they did. Even the laypersons, if you look at the poetry, they understood what those things meant. True today and understood as true back then, none of your scientific theories are the final answer. So they weren't scientismists. They were scientists. They were clearly able to do science in a sense, but they weren't scientismists. At least they had the tools necessary. So it's not like the scientific project was looked at in the same way as it was looked at post Descartes, but but they clearly understood how to be scientific and what a scientific question was. And if you had a question amenable to empirical consequence, they understood how to approach it in that way. However, that wasn't the main thing that they were concerned with. Hmm. And they understood something very important that I believe we've forgotten, which is that you can have 1,000 stories that take into account all of the appearances, all of the observations. And, you can have stupid stories that contradict them and you can just throw those out. But if all you want to do is make sure that it matches observation, there's no limit to how many stories you can come up with for that. And you have no reason scientifically to decide between those various theories, except that you want to use Occam's razor and keep the simplest one. That's There's no suggestion that that's more true. It's just, hey, it's easier to tell and remember and utilize the formulas for that. Okay, there's some reasonableness to using Occam's razor, but you shouldn't believe that you found the truth that way. Now, advanced scientists today, good scientists, they all know that, and they don't believe that they can prove things are true scientifically. They just know that they can disregard ideas that don't work and hold everything with an open hand as like this is the best theory I have so far. But the average layperson today has a scientism attitude, which says, "Oh, there's some guys in a lab coat and they found the truth." I don't know what they're imagining. Like you look in a microscope and you find etched on the side of a subatomic particle, "Gravity is the answer," or something. Like I don't know how they imagine those things are happening. What's happening is we have a collection of facts and we have to come up with stories that make sense of those facts, which allow us to predict the likelihood of other phenomena given starting points. And we can do all of that. And that's great. But the idea that I found and discovered gravity, I've proven this thing, it's no, I've disproven a story that doesn't match with appearances. That we can do maybe, but that's about it. The medieval man, the layperson, understood all of that. He recognized, hey, that scientific way of thinking, that's pretty clever. It's not gonna give me ultimate truth or anything like that, but it's a great way to make sure I'm not making mistakes that my ideas don't line up with things that are observable phenomena. Alright, so they understood that scientific theories were not a final answer and that methods we have only give us provisional acceptable theories. The layman understood this better than the layman now, but even the layman then didn't apply it to the model as well. So he even says, look, even though that's understandable to everybody, um, oh, I think I wrote that very poorly. I think the idea there was obviously laypersons are not going to be rigorous scientists, but I don't think that was the point he was making. I think what he was saying is that simple point that like, okay, but my cosmology doesn't have to match my astrophysics. If we're asking scientific questions astrophysically, I can understand what the scientists are talking about there, but cosmology, that's a story, and a story is a narrative, and it's based on characters, and it doesn't have to be physically the correct depiction of things. So we'll look at some examples of those, but one of the most astonishing ones we've read in C.S. Lewis, it blew my mind when I read it, was that geocentrism is not anthropocentrism. Geocentrism is anthropoperipheric. And that blew my mind. But what he shows is that the story of your place in the cosmos, that might be different than your astrophysics, right? So, oh, I'm on a globe and it's spinning round another source of light, and there are other sources of lights which would dwarf this globe, and they're even bigger globes. Those are called the stars. They might understand all that, and they did. But the story of who I am in relationship on a material terrestrial level with a spiritual level on a cosmic, that might be more like, hey, the earth's in the middle and it's the lowest thing, and then there's these realms of authority and influence which are actually concerned with other things outside, in pointing outward at to the highest. And so incidentally the things they do affect my level, but they're not even doing the things they're doing to affect my level. And so as I travel up through those realms, or as a character in a poem travels up through those realms, they see the concavity of the barriers between these realms, and there's different types of creatures that live in these realms, and I'm traveling up through. But if they look back down, they see convexness, which is the opposite of concavity, and they look down and they see the pointlessness and the silliness and the meaninglessness of every ambition and hatred and thriving and drive that occupies people on earth. In other words, it was understood by them that the material description in the story is a photographic negative of the spiritual reality. So if you wanted to say earth is on the margin of the margin of the margin, a speck of dust on a speck of dust on a speck of dust of the things that are cosmically important, you would describe it materially as the center. This is blowing my mind. When I realized what he was showing there, it was blowing my mind. I was like, "Oh my goodness." So not only did they understand Earth was not at the center physically, but they said, "In my story of who I am in the world, I'm gonna put Earth at the margin of the margin of the margin, so I'll describe it materially at the center, because the material is an inverse picture of the spiritual reality in my fictional story." These people were highly sophisticated. Anybody who sits down and says, "Ah, those medievals, they thought the earth was flat," and okay, we all know that that's not true. We've all heard, no, they knew it was round. But to understand just how sophisticated their ways of thinking were, I think it rivals ours. It might even dwarf ours. If the poet is not writing in a mystical way, he has to refer to things which fit the model that his audience has of the cosmos. So we can detect from the poetry what expert ideas, what ancient ideas, what Gaelic ideas, what Platonic or Aristotelian ideas, what Arabic ideas, etc., existed in the minds of the laypersons who read those works. The medievals had access to physics and to cosmology, understood the difference, and could hold both ideas in their minds at the same time. Okay, you have permission to do it too, if you can get out of your scientism attitude. It's very, very much a limiting cult. You get to have all of your access to science and the fruits of science still, but you get to maybe like open up your eyes a bit more beyond that. The medievals could do it. So could the ancients, as he shows. Chapter 2, big mistake, thinking that the cosmology of the medievals came to them from their religious beliefs. Now, this is something else that's weird, and he shows this in the poetry. It's like there's a war between their religious beliefs and their cosmology. This is really an astonishing observation to make here. It seems to us that the medievals were like, I read my Bible, and my Bible tells me that God's more important than man, and that maybe this is my cosmology. I'll set up this story. It's like, no, no, no. It was more like attention. It was, these are a bunch of writings from pagan and Christian sources, and I've got to make them all fit together because I am having a hard time believing that they're not true because they were written down. And it just seems like, why would you write this down if there wasn't some sort of truth in it? And I got to make them fit so that they're not contradicting each other, because I can't have logically contradictory stuff within my model. He says, another thing he points out is that pagans and Christians in that classical and transitional period as Christianity is taking over, but what's really taking over might be this new model that actually is incorporating everything. The Christians of that time and the pagans of that time, the serious ones, were about this far away from each other compared to us. Like, we are nowhere near a Christian at that time, and we're basically the exact same distance from a pagan. They were much more like each other than either of them were like us. And we saw last night while reading Plutarch about Numa that the spiritually serious, if I describe Numa the way Plutarch did in the video we did last night, you would think I was describing a Christian ascetic who's decided to forego concern of anything political, anything that has to do with like fame and fortune and all that other stuff, who's trying to just live a careful spiritual life and be nice to his neighbors or something. I mean, it's we have this idea that, oh, the pagans want to dance naked in the woods and the Christians want to be all very serious and be like, ooh, no happiness for anybody. And it turns out the pagans are scolding the Christians for not being serious and dour enough sometimes. And that they want to believe in their gods because they have highly sophisticated spiritual concepts about their place in the world. And he shows the pagans saying, "Hey, no, 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 we believe in one God too, and we have a system, and this is all the like they're competing with each other to be the same type of thing as much as they're in war with each other, more so." Okay. Christian ideas are in tension with the pagan ones, which still permeated their culture, and they were engaged in a tense project of harmonizing these. That's what the medievals do. So after that classical period, it's like, okay, we've still got these writings and we got to make these things work together. This is directly the reverse of what we usually imagine, that they gave us their ideas because they were stuck to their religious commitments. They're actually developing their ideas. Okay, so we read through those introductory parts. We're going to try to read through the rest of the book, but we have also read more. So now we start looking at the poetry. We know what his method is. We know how he's going to do it, what his aim is, and what his thesis is, that they're creating a model of trying to make sense of all these different sources of truth and put them into one big thing with no contradictions. Very much they got to systematize and organize. And we've been reading Thomas Aquinas and we see how much, oh, here's a question. Well, actually, there's three versions of that question. And this version has to be treated in eight different ways. And the first one, he's just dividing everything up into little bits so that you can have like little categories and cubbies where you can eventually sort of make all of these truths fit and hopefully not discard any that are true, not have to. All right, looking at the poetry, selected materials, the classical period. So let's start with the classics. Let's start with the pagans. Let's go before the Christianity stuff. We'll start there and we'll transition in. Too many literary sources necessary to read and understand our subject on how the medieval mind saw the world. There's the Bible, there's Virgil, there's Ovid, etc. We're not going to talk about any of the big ones. He's going to look at poems that you haven't heard of before. Selected materials, the classical period. Too many scientific sources necessary to read to understand our subject of how medieval minds saw the world. Ptolemy, books on pre-Copernican astronomy. No time for any of that here. Everybody knows, go get a book. This is what the experts are thinking. We're going to look at poetry and literature, and we're going to say what the average man think about it because the poem wouldn't have made sense to him unless he had that idea in his head. Uh, we're going to do something different. That's so. Selected materials. We will look at the least easily accessible poems. So one of the things that's amazing about these lectures is C.S. Lewis just gets up there and he's trying to make a point about the way classical or medieval people thought. And he's just effortlessly quoting poems you've never heard of before. He's just quoting them and saying, well, in this poem, blame not my lute, blah, blah, blah says blah, blah, blah. And that wouldn't make any sense. There's a joke there, but how could you understand that joke unless you thought this way? And so he's gonna be it's really impressive. Least generally known to educated people. Okay. So this is what he wants to focus on is what did the average everyday person think was a funny joke, a good song, a clever poem, something that they meditated on, that bedtime stories. We're gonna look at that and then look at the content of those stories to say, okay, how did these people understand the world? And those which best illustrate curious process whereby the model assimilated them. Okay. He's done a few examples of the third already, and they're quite impressive. Where in the poetry itself, it's illustrating to you how they're piecing together this Platonic idea with this Christian idea or whatever. The All right. So first, we're going to look at the third, fourth, and fifth centuries in the next chapter. All right, I think that's what we do. These are from the third, fourth, and fifth. All right. Somnian Scipionis. All right, we're looking at Plato's Republic. And then Cicero's Republic, ending with a similar version of the afterlife, where somebody comes and tells you, I died and went to the afterlife, and here's what it looks like. All right, remember, we're in the classical period before we get to medievals. Gives a psychological explanation for why an individual had a particular dream. He notices that there's actually like 7 types of dreams. Freudian interpretation was already an idea that was available to them that they were utilizing. He makes a lot of really cool points. You can watch the previous videos where we read the text. Character travels to the heavenly realm. Okay, goes to the heavenly realm, looking down with contempt on the smallness of what is on earth. And it has that geocentric, series of globes around of spheres of influence and authority. That picture. A public mean can achieve this realm, achieve immortality after they die. Okay, so this classical, right? If you're a really good politician and you make the state better, you might achieve immortality. Prohibition against suicide in all cases. This is because we are the property of the gods. So we had this idea in Plato. We have this idea again. He says, I'm not sure how Christians got the idea that suicide is a sin unless it came from this. He doesn't see scriptural evidence for why in the Judeo-Christian text suicide should be a sin. And so he suggests, I think I'm seeing them assimilate some stuff. It was the Romans and the Greeks who had this idea that you belong to the gods and you can dispatch their property until they call you. The stars are globes which outstrip the earth in size. They knew that. So this is the physical side of it again. Mortifying human ambition. These texts are using the description of the heavenly bodies. The music of the spheres is in this text. It's very early stuff, right? As is the idea of the earthbound ghost, also from Plato. We know that. Okay, so here's a whole bunch of ideas that are literarily important today. We know what they mean just by referencing their by referring to them in a few words. And of course, they were very important in medieval literature. And look, they're all in here before we even get the medieval started. The sun is described as the world's mind. We got mens mundi. We have mens oculus, mundi oculus, the world's eye. We have mundi animus, the spirit or animating spirit of the world. This is what the sun is being described as in various different texts. Pliny, Ovid. Okay. Bernardus, Sylvester uses both mens mundi and mundi denascu oculus. So the world's eye, the world's mind. Milton, presumably having read Bernardus, but presumably not having read Bernardus, but certainly having read Somnium and Ovid, and probably Pliny, does the same. Thou son of this great world, both eye and soul, says he. Shelley may be thinking of Milton to a higher level, the eye with which the universe beholds itself and knows itself divine. Have you ever heard an awesome scientist? Known a few physicists describe the Big Bang. Matter comes together, hydrogen becomes helium, that the world might contemplate itself. Helios. They often say it exactly that way. I've talked to scientists who, when they're trying to be poetic about what's going on with this whole cosmology, Big Bang story of theirs, they're like, well, the materials started to come together because of gravity. You got a lot of hydrogen. It makes a nuclear furnace and helium and explodes. And this is the raw material of what we become. And now we've evolved the consciousness. This is their story. I'm not endorsing it, but they say exactly this. They say the hydrogen's coming together to make helium that the universe might understand itself, might contemplate itself. So the helios of the sun is still even in their version of the story. I've noticed that just in the last 20, 30 years in conversations with people who are trying to wax poetic whilst doing science. Anyway, Scipio. More important is the general character of these texts. Look up and despise this earthly world. So look now, he even, well, we'll read it, but he even says, the purpose of vision is not if you ask today, what's the purpose of vision? Oh, to be able to spot predators and make sure you can stay alive. There's a survival advantage. Yeah, okay, fine. That's one level of analysis. That's one way of examining the question. Uh, in the Scipio, the purpose of vision is that you might accidentally look up and see the stars and then start to wonder about higher transcendent things and then pursue philosophy and maybe religion and try to get understanding of the divine realms. The purpose of hearing is from music, he says. Glory may be different between the classics and the Christians. Okay, there might be a different concept there, but what man can attain might be different, sure. But the marginality and lowness of earth in relationship to absolute and unchanging heavenly realms is here. All right. You don't need the Christians to show up for the classics, for the ancients, to be giving us a legacy of here's the deal, all your little bickering fights and your ambitious business plans and all that other stuff, if you could see what that looked like from above, you'd laugh at yourself. Okay, then we have a cool idea. Oh, this idea, he's looking at the classics. I never mentioned this when we read it before. Remember, we're looking at the ancients, Greeks and Roman type stuff in the time of the Romans. But we've got this idea of the antipodes, and we've got this idea of the five regions. This idea was very much present when Columbus decided to sail the ocean blue. It was very much present when uh, Jonathan Swift was writing Gulliver's Travels. It was believed for a very long time that it was not possible to cross the equator, that nothing could live there because it was too hot, that the poles were too cold. And so there's two regions of Earth that are too cold for life, and there's a region in the middle that's too hot. So if you happen to have been born on the north or in the southern hemisphere, you were never going to meet the alien life that lived just on the other side of the house. Like Martian alien life was right across the border, but there was no way people could live around the torrid zone. So this is an idea that they have of the way the earth is. Now, there's probably a lot of truth to that. At certain times, right? There's certainly peoples without a technology that would allow them to travel through certain versions of equatorial zones and things like that. But they sort of treated it like a cosmic reality. It would be like saying, hey, Earth is here, Venus is there, and Mars is over here. Venus is too hot for life, we think. Depends on what kind of life could exist, right? But we can say something like that. We say, Mars, maybe we could settle. Okay. So we've got ideas of, we don't know. We don't know what technology is going to exist. We don't know if it's possible or what's going to happen. They're doing the exact same thing. There's nothing unfair about that. And the antipodes, what a great word. You've all seen the memes of Australia upside down as if like somehow they're like trying not to fall off the earth and whatever. That's the antipodes, the people whose feet are opposite to yours. You step left, they're stepping right, and it's like the opposite mirror image because they're on the other side of the globe, and will never Mark Twain will meet. Okay, so Seneca and Gallo, Lucan, Dante mentions Lucan with the other great Virgil, Ovid, Statius. Albertus Magnus cites Lucan to give factual support to the idea that there is actually such a division of regions right after he uses a scientific source to support it. Okay, so pause. He wants to see how are the medievals thinking. And he says, look at what Magnus does here. He's asking the question, is it scientifically true, right? Because he understands cosmologically, okay, that's a cool story. That gives me an idea of backward thinking or backward walking versus, two different worlds as mirror images and stuff. That's fine. But is it actually scientifically true that you can never travel that way? And of course, when we did start traveling that way, there was alien life that was brought all over the earth, right? Like a large reason perhaps why there's been a lot of extinctions is that we kind of brought all the continents together and made all the animals fight it out together, whereas there used to be lots of little islands where you could have different unique versions of things that are fitting the same types of niches on these different continents. But we made a Pangea Earth again just by creating the technology to travel and move all the animals around. But you bring horses over here, you bring potatoes over there, you bring germs you didn't even know existed over here, and suddenly everything is we've been mixing up alien life because we brought all these continents back together. And so Magnus is saying, now, wait a minute, hold on a second. Is it really true that there's two different globes with or two different regions on this one globe where life must exist and develop separate from each other with no communication between the two? And he cites scientific sources to try to determine if it's true. But then right after that, he adds more evidence. He says, oh, and by the way, Lucan wrote a poem about it. And C.S. Lewis is going, wait a minute, what? What's going on here? What does this tell us about how medieval man thought? Written sources were authoritative, and maybe they have both astrophysics and cosmology, but maybe it's not very clear in their mind when they're supposed to be doing one versus the other. Maybe the border between them is a bit fuzzy. Maybe it's like, well, I can do astrophysics, sure, but also remember this poem says that it's like this, and we got to make those things make sense together. But they don't have to make sense with the physics. They got to make sense with everything. So now there's like you don't have solid science yet. You don't have a solid commitment to science. You also don't have the error of scientism, right? Which we've noticed. But you also there's okay, wait a minute. You're quoting a poet to say this authoritative figure describing the cosmos described it that way. Therefore, there's some evidence that it's true. Why would that matter to anybody who read it? It would only matter if C.S. Lewis is correct that in their minds, incorporating the texts, not just the appearances, which they understood you had to do, observable facts have to be incorporated, but the texts have to be incorporated. So you can say, yeah, this one can be true and this one can be true at the same time. And here's how they can fit together. Here's the way that they are saying the same thing, or the way that there's space for them both to making observations that are true because the texts were just sort of authoritative. All right. The classical period still. Lucan talks about the moon being the barrier between the heavenly realms and the earth. Okay, this is another cosmological idea. Again, at the same time, you can understand the physical reality is different than the story about who you are, but both are true. It's not like, so remember, it's not like, oh, astrophysics, I understand that. That's the true truth. But the cosmology is a useful story. It's like, no, no, no. Astrophysics is one way of thinking about it. I got that. I've got a story about who I am and my place in the cosmos. Those have to be integrated, but they don't have to be integrated as if observable facts are the final authority. They have to be integrated in the sense that I have to understand that this one's true and understand that this one's true without contradiction. But this one was never about the physical description in the first place. It's not a materialistic explanation. So I do have to fit them together, but I don't have to fit them together by saying, well, let me change what I believe about the shape of the earth. It's like, no, I get it. The earth is not really at the center of everything. It's the opposite of that. It's marginal. It's on, right? But the way I describe that poetically is I say it's at the middle and at the bottom, and it's the garbage from creation that just sort of fell down there. And so I'm going to describe it that way. Why? Because my astrophysics says it's a tiny little globe that's dwarfed by everything else that's not even the center of anything. So I have the same truth in both stories, and there's no contradiction there. But I understand cosmology is not physics. So there isn't a contradiction because the literary poetic description is not literally the description. At the same time, now it's hard for us to wrap our minds around this. At the same time as they've got both those ideas, they want both to be true and they want to fit them in together. And so not have contradictions. So let's see how this goes. Lucan talks about the moon being the barrier between the heavenly realms and the earthly. Looking down from heaven, your earthly concerns make you laugh with contempt at the silliness of it all. We see that in the poem. Concave when looking up, convex when looking down. So, what is the answer to this? How can you say, "Ugh, I know the earth is traveling round, it's not the center, I know the moon, I know there's much bigger things out there, but then also say, no, 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 on a disk, and there's this dome. And then once you get past the moon, things are not airy anymore. Things are aethery. And you're getting closer and closer past the transition period to the divine realm where the gods dwell. And never shall they really come down here, but only through mediators that live in that middle ground. How can you believe all of that and at the same time believe, oh, the stars are much bigger than we are, and we're basically in a little bit of nothing, and we're floating around and we're on the margin and all that other stuff from a physical description, and we're a globe and all of that? How can you believe both of those? And the answer is, when you're doing cosmology, you understand how to read literarily. You understand this is a metaphor. This is a story to tell me a truth. And what's the story telling me? It's telling me I'm not at the center. Why? Because the earth's at the center. What? And modern man goes, what do you mean you're not at the center because the earth's at the center? He says, no, earth, that's where all of the dirt and the garbage from creation just sort of gathered together. It's basically the outskirts of hell. I mean, if you looked at it spatially, you're right near hell and you're just sort of living on this terrestrial globe. And if you were up in those eternal regions and looking down, you'd go, oh my gosh, all my things I was worried about in my life, none of them even mattered. This is where the real stuff's happening. Okay, there's a mirror image of what the cosmos looks like between the two perspectives. That's just a literary feature, and that it's understood. The material description in the literary story, not the scientific one. The material description is an inverse of the spiritual reality. That's why Earth's at the center. Evolving over time, late to the classics, she became okay. So now we have something pretty wild. C.S. Lewis is sticking with the ancients so far, and he's saying, okay, right before we get to this transition to medieval times, what about Lady Nature? She shows up in a lot of poems. She doesn't show up until the ends. She's not really a character in early stories. She's there maybe, but like not dynamically involved in stuff. What's going on? Well, he says as he traces through the poetry, he says she couldn't be everything. She had to become less than everything to be a character. Okay. And so as we get this division of heaven and earth, we can start to have, okay, Lady Nature, she's she's not everything. She's nature. And there's a divinity outside of that. And now you can have a relation. Now she can start to take shape. But it was only at the end of the classical period that she started to emerge. But that's also the beginning of the kickstart of the medievals. So we understand it's like Deus ex nihilo, right? God is outside. It's not all the cosmos. There's a division now between, and that's a new development he sees. So he looks through the poems about that. You have to heaven and earth, a distinction natura took her form. You have to invent a heaven, is see creation. She steps forward and can be understood, studied, related to, and now isn't simply all. She motivates feeling. So he's looking at how this is developing. She motivates feeling more in the medieval literature, which comes later because the heavenly, as distinct from her, allowed her to take form, and this only happened at the late classical period. Her proper place, this is his theory, her proper place below the moon in relationship to the more masculine heaven, which reigns upon her and in her and allows her to be fruitful. Okay, we're seeing these are literary devices, and we're understanding all that. Did Deo Socrates, all right, the daemon, okay, we're just going through the slides here of what we've already read, and then we're going to try to read the rest of C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image, which is about using poetry, analyzing it to understand how medieval man thought. We're in the classical period still. One of the things we realize now about the daemons, and there's a lot of Christian ideas are coming from these classics. And so the ancients are saying, look, there's two realms. There's the heavenly realm, there's the earthly realm. Those things are fundamentally different, so there has to be a third thing. They're always looking for the triad, and so is medieval man. What is the thing in between the two that allows two such different things to communicate? Because obviously, two fundamentally different things, if you think about them, can't affect each other, right? It's like, how can a spirit knock over a domino? How can a domino affect the spiritual realm? Like a physical thing, the material and spiritual, where's the translation? It's the demonic realm. It's right near where the moon is. Like there's this transition from sky to aether or from air to sky, depending on what words are being used by which persons. But there's this distinction between these two regions, and basically the idea that was handed to the medievals, that they could look at these texts and say, okay, that's how the world works, were you have these two realms, they're fundamentally opposite and different, and then there's this demonic realm, and rationality tells you that if there's human intelligence governing over the terrestrial and divine intelligence in heaven, that there should be some sort of intelligence. They have bodies rarer than air, right? So there's like they're made of something, maybe forces or electrical force or something. They have bodies, but they're living in a realm of impulse and it gets very poetic and interesting. We won't try to understand it right now, but the demonic. And so Socrates's daemon was a spirit that basically came from the gods. The gods aren't going to come down and be able to talk directly to us. It's translated through the messengers of the demonic. And so you get the ideas of genies obviously from this. You get ideas of demons and angels from this. A lot of Christian and Arabic Muslim notions are all scientifically and logically and philosophically and theologically in all four different ways being worked out as like this must be how it is. Now, we can disagree with them if we want to. We're not trying to disagree or agree with them. We're just trying to understand how they thought. All right, the model, because of classical reasoning shared by the medievals, requires a triad. So the medievals shared this. If there's a heaven and there's an earth, there's a realm between the two, the demigods, daimonic realm, populated for the logic of no wasted space without intelligences, just as earth and heaven are both. Classically, men might attain to that middle realm. Okay, so there were stories and poems of, he almost breathes the aether. He was such a great political statesman and saved us from drought and famine and enemies that were coming to attack, that he's transcended towards where the moon's realm is. And he lives up there and he's basically breathing immortal air of the gods, maybe like the air that is flowing off the he's at the floor of heaven. Okay, living under the floorboards of heaven, way higher than we are. Okay, classically, men might attain to that middle realm. Finer in their composition than the material of clouds. Okay, so he's saying like, yeah, they're made of something, those creatures, but it's like it's rarer than air. All right, so we have a picture of this, and then they say, well, the moon stands between those two realms. And then you find out it's actually more like a transition where like you get closer and closer and closer. It gets rarer and rarer. It's like less molecular air and more aether as you move through transitions there in some poems. Necessary for communication between two incompatible opposites. Transition and communication between above and below the middle realm. We understood why they were thinking that. Okay, so he's giving us these ideas that are how medieval man is thinking, is looking at the classical period. Now we're going to look at the seminal period. So this is a transition where you've got pagans and Christians battling it out, talking it out, arguing it out, agreeing with each other, borrowing things from each other, competing with each other to see who can be the most aesthetic and who can care the most about spiritual matters instead of earthly matters. And it's not at all the story, because again, he says pagan pagan religious leaders, spiritual theologians, and Christian ones were much more like each other than either of them are like us. We're very different from either of them. They're basically two sides of the same coin in this period. In fact, we've started looking at some of these authors, and there's always a debate about whether or not they were pagan or Christian. So he gives us his opinion on each of them. Um, this is the period that we're going to look at. Pagans and medieval Christians were more like each other than they are to us. Leaders were both monotheistic. Their leaders were. They both believed in a plethora of intermediary deities between God and man. A world renouncing aesthetic marked the most eminent pagans as much as any Christians. We actually read that when we were reading Numa. We're reading Numa as he came up with laws. We're looking at the classical pagans before we're even to this transition period and saying the most spiritually serious people are being described like the most aesthetic monks you've ever read about. Okay, this isn't pagans dancing naked in the woods, happy to be alive, everything's great. Ooh, mean Christians saying we need to care about spiritual matters, no more being happy, anybody. It's like pagan serious pagan religious leaders and enthusiasts would put to shame the self-whipping monk that you're imagining from the 1400s, like, in a lot of ways. Okay, so both would have looked superstitious to us. Who would have thought, "Hey, wait a minute, you're both like, it's not just, oh, the pagans believe in magical stuff, but those Christians are being very careful that there's God and there's man and no doing witchcraft." It's like, nah, from our perspective, if you were looking at the way the Christians were acting or the pagans were acting as serious, religious, spiritual people, you'd be like, they're both pretty superstitious. They believe in a lot of signs, they believe in a lot of mystical things. Why'd the lightning strike? I think God's saying something. He might be. Many of the figures in this period are surrounded by debates from us today, trying to figure out if they were Christian or pagan. Okay, so that's one of the features we're going to see as we look at these guys. Remoter philosophical ideas were not popularly grasped. So we have trouble seeing how true this is because we aren't sure if a proposition is being presented to a specific audience or another. Okay, so he's going to spend a lot of time being like, are you writing to talk about the scientific reality? Are you writing to create a popular poem? Are you writing to incorporate and show how you can understand both ideas are true at the same time? What's going on here? And it gets a little confusing sometimes, and we'll look at some examples. The pagans and medieval Christians were more like each other. Right? So they competed with one another to accomplish the same goals. They borrowed from one another. They fought, but they also traded intellectually. Some splinters want to say some splitters want to say that they're totally different and at war. Some conglomerators want to say that they were basically the same and that the classics were getting what the Christ or were getting to what the Christians figured out. And it's really just Christianity is the next development of this pagan understanding. All right. There's always those two camps, if in any subject. Hey, I found a new trilobite. It looks a little different than another trilobite fossil. You found a new species. No, that's just in the family of trilobites. There's always those two groups that are arguing with each other. And so, as we try to sort out where we fall on that spectrum of this question, understand that it's not the simple cartoon version that we've always been told, which is, oh, these were totally different and they were fighting with each other. As we've seen and as we will continue to see, read the religious spiritual pagans, and it sounds like you're reading somebody who's a much more serious Christian today than anybody you've ever read. All right, so the first one we look at is Chalcidius, and there's a debate. Was he Christian or pagan? In favor of his Christianity, the dedication to Osius, always assuming that he really was a bishop. He calls the biblical account of Adam's creation the teaching of a holier sect. So he's like, here's a story, but there's a holier story. Okay, so he's calling it holier. Sounds like he's biased towards the Christian story. After glancing at a supposed astrological doctrine in Homer, mentions the star of the nativity as some. All right, got a bunch of sources here. Don't know why I included that in a copy paste into the slides. He described, and while you're reading this book, I had AI go through the book. It's like this thick. The book is not that thick, and just pull out all the references, and it's its own book. It's like, it's just there's a lot. Okay, he describes himself as deriving from the divine law truths to which Plato had been guided by the impulse instinctus of truth herself. Okay, so that all sounds like he's probably pretty Christian in this transition period because he's saying, oh, even Plato got to the same truths, but that's implicitly saying these are the truths. And so look at that. He got to the same thing we got to. All right, but then there's arguments on the other hand that he was a pagan. When he draws on the Old Testament, instead of calling it the sacred writings, he usually says merely that he's following the Hebraim. As witnesses to the benefits we mortals have received from good daemons, he summons all Greeks, Latins, and barbarians. This is a sharp contrast with St. Augustine's view that all the daemons of paganism were evil. They were demons in the latter sense of the word. In one place, he treats the divine inspiration of Moses as something open to doubt, not something you'd expect a Christian to do as readily. He cites Homer, Hesiod, and Empedocles as if they were no less to be taken into account than the sacred writers. He describes providence as nous or mind, a being which holds the second place after the Somus Deus, but whom it is perfected as it perfects all other things. This is very much more like the Neoplatonic Trinity than the Christian. The Neoplatonic Trinity than the Christian. He discusses at great length whether Silva, matter, is inherently evil without once mentioning the Christian doctrine that God made all things and pronounced them all very good. That one I don't think he should have included here as evidence of paganism because I mean, maybe. Okay, fine. If we're being very serious here, but Paul, the whole spirit man, flesh man thing distinction is also very mirror image of Platonic. But yeah, you can get Christians to talk that way pretty easily. Okay, he wholly rejects the anthropocentric cosmology of Genesis, in which the heavenly bodies were made to give light upon the earth. He holds it would be absurd to suppose the blessed and eternal things above the moon were ordered for the sake of perishable things below. He says that he's using philosophy and rationality to criticize the traditional Christian view of Genesis and say there's something wrong with that. Again, they have astrophysics, they have cosmology, but they're not exactly clear on the border between the two, and they're trying to just get to truth. And so they're looking at literary sources and they're reading Genesis maybe a little scientifically there and saying, well, that can't possibly be why it was created. Okay, so Lewis gives us his view. He's going to read Chalcidius very carefully, and he's going to say, my view is that he was a Christian writing philosophically. He accepted as matter of faith, excluded from his arguments, translating much of the Timaeus to find Plato for much of the Middle Ages. Forms are thoughts in the mind of God. So this just early transition period. We're already to the point where the Platonic forms become ideas in the mind of God. Plato was more like Moses for him than he is to us. So he's translating half of one of Plato's works, which is all he had access to, and basically gives early medieval man the idea they had of Plato. And the idea they have of Plato, because of that, is basically more like a Moses than what we think of Plato as. He has contemptus mundi, right? Contempt for the world, so for the earth. It's the earth is low and material and temporal and changing and mutable and composite and mortal and dying. And, like there's the heavenly realm and then there's this low earth thing. His methods, the same from this partial book. Reincarnation, not literally. He says demigods and lesser gods demoted to daemons. Okay, so he's saying there's the gods and then there's the lesser gods. No. There's God, and there's these spiritual things that are much lesser. They're in a different realm, halfway between there and this low earth. They don't count as godlike things. They're not demigods. They're daemons. Okay, so he's getting that Christian translation over to there's angels and demons. They aren't God either. And they're not like God. They're not the nature of God. They don't dwell on the highest realm as God does, type of thing. He says, accept this on faith, leave it from our work. Macrobius has the category of unfulfilled wish. Chalcidius has other categories, but not this one. Okay, so we're talking about dreams now. So Macrobius has this idea that a dream is an unfulfilled wish. We've looked at that, but we skipped over it for the notes. Chalcidius has other categories, but not this one. So he's got like 7 categories of dreams. The higher realms explain all our sufferings, but these are incidental to their workings, not the purpose for which they exist. Anthropoperipherality is the quality of their geocentrism, which he shows in the poetry. It's pretty wild. The purpose of sight is that it begets philosophy, not to survive this world. We talked about all of that. Hearing is for the sake of music. Okay. Matt, why is this here a third time? I don't know. Oh, daemons are a distinct species, not something to which man can aspire. So these are transitionally, he's working this out and it's changing a bit. The voice which came from Socrates came from God. The daemon is the mean between the two worlds and their inhabitants. And we've got a systematic way of thinking that says if this is fundamentally opposite to that, you cannot have communication between the two unless there's a transitional median in between. And there's logical reasons for that. We're not gonna get into all the philosophy or the religious theological notions or the literary concepts of it right now, but that's what's being developed for this model that medieval man has of the cosmos. Okay, so we're starting to see a picture. It's a lot like the classical one we were looking at. We've got heaven or sky or aether or where the God lives. We've got the daemons, the angels and demons, the genies above the air, below ether, right? But it's below the aether, but it's above the air. And then you have the terrestrial, the earthly, the temporal, the limited, the obedient, the influenced, the mortal, the human realm. Okay. Man himself is divided the same way as the cosmos, right? He has his rationality. This is very Platonic, right? You can see the influence of the ancient classics right through this. Man has his reason, and that should rule. He has his heart and his honor and his passions and his impulses and things that are mirror of that. And then he has his appetitive hungers, right? He's like, I'm driven for sex and food and things like that. And so, if it's in right order, things are going to go well. And if this is not in charge, things are going to go crazy. Okay. And the cosmos is ordered in exactly the same way. And this picture is starting to emerge. And you can see you could have just read Plato basically for this so far. But there's some refinement and there's some, like, well, who are these daemons and what is that realm and why is it below the other realm and where is the transition period between the two and why is that necessary? Because you can't communicate between opposites. And okay, fine. So now we're going to get into Macrobius. So all of that video is just slides that might have been useful for everything we've read so far. And what we're going to do is continue chapter 4 today. And I would why don't we just keep this recording going instead of starting a new one? So I'm gonna leave this up here, gonna move it over here, gonna add this. That should catch you up through the first two videos where we've been reading. And let's see if we can make this a little bit awesomer. Cool. So section B, Macrobius. And we're in this section of the transitional period from the classics to the medievals. And we're going to try to understand the way that the medievals thought about the cosmos. And C.S. Lewis's contention is that they were basically engaged in a systematic organization of many different sources to try to make them all fit together to create their model. Macrobius lived at the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 5th centuries. His religion also has been doubted. But there seems no solid reasons for supposing that it was other than paganism. So he's going to say this guy was probably a pagan. He belonged, however, to a circle in which Christian and pagan could freely mingle. The Christian Albinus and that great pagan champion of the elder of the great pagan champion, the elder Symmachus, were among his friends. Of his two works, the Saturnalia, a long, learned, urbane, and rambling conversation piece, does not concern us. Our business is with his contemporary on the Somnium Scipius. This and the text which accompanied it saved the part of Cicero's Republic for us. Saved that part of Cicero's Republic for us. Okay. So we have the dream of the afterlife that's depicted in one of his other writings. Nearly 50 manuscripts survive. It was a work of immense reputation and long-lasting influence. On geography, Macrobius repeats Cicero's doctrine of the 5 zones. It is reasonable to suppose that the southern temperate zone is, like ours, inhabited. Reasonable to suppose, right? This is an alien. I wonder if there's life on Mars. That's what they're thinking about the southern hemisphere. And and trying to figure out if we ever could even empirically find out. And he says, yeah, it's reasonable to suppose that it's inhabited. I guess if they're walking opposite to us. They're the antipodes. But we never have had and shall never have the possibility of discovering by whom. Might make you sad, might make you long at the time, a wish, but it's too cold at the North Pole, it's too cold at the South Pole. Now, they don't even believe they can travel to the Southern Hemisphere, but they understand that there's a pole on a globe that's too cold to live on the other side. And they believe it's too hot around the equator for people to even travel between the two. It's just it's a torrid zone. You're not gonna make it. So life, whatever life is over there, it probably exists because you can't go from too hot to too cold without a transition middle, right? Hotness and coldness, opposites and incompatible. There must be a middle transition. This is the way that they're reasoning about things. Anyway, so let's continue. Macrobius finds it still necessary, it would not have been in the Middle Ages, to remove a childish misunderstanding of what we call gravitation. There is no danger lest the inhabitants of the southern hemisphere should fall off into the nether sky. The Earth's surface is down for them as it is for us. The ocean covers most of the torrid zone. All right, there's not even a lot of land there anyway, so you're not got anything to walk over. Plus, it's too hot if there was. Two great branches from it in the east and two in the west flow north and south to meet at the poles. From the meeting of their currents, the tides result. The dry land thus falls into four main divisions. This isn't actually that bad of a picture from a scientific perspective either. It's not very detailed, but they believed they couldn't even travel to go take data from these areas anyway. This is, I think the reason why the ocean has paths and there's like currents that flow in certain ways from the little bit that we're seeing is you got a lot of hot here, you got a lot of cold here and here, and there's going to be movement that way. And then it's like, well, it's not wrong. It's also not indicative of people who are thinking in some sort of mysteriously weird kind of a way. All right, the dry land thus falls into four main divisions. The great land mass of Europe, Asia, and Africa is doubtless one of these four. A, dia- a, dia- a diagrammatically simplified version of this layout survives in the latter wheel maps, as we have cut off in space from the antipodes, so we are almost cut off in time from most of the past. Nearly the whole human race has frequently been destroyed by great global catastrophes. Nearly, for there has always been a remnant. Okay, or probably we wouldn't be here, right? So, all right, so we're cut off from most parts of the globe, and also most of the past we're cut off from because there's a lot of these big catastrophes that just leave remnants of people. Egypt has never been destroyed. This is why the Egyptian records remount to an antiquity elsewhere unknown. Okay, we've seen that before in some of the texts we've been reading. He's finding it in their poetry. The idea goes back to Plato's Timaeus, which is in its turn which in its turn may have been suggested by the delightful story in Herodotus. Hecataeus, the historian visiting Egyptian Thebes, boasted that he was descended from a god in the 16th generation, which would take him safely back to a period before any continuous Greek records. Then the priest took him into a hall, this is a good story, where stood the statues of those who had held the hereditary priesthood and traced the line back, son to father, son to father. When they had reached the 145th generation, they had still not come to within sight of a god or even a demigod. All right. So these Greeks are like, hey, we've got this long tradition in this record. Let's go to Egypt and see what they have. Holy mackerel. The earth is so old that historical records of father, son, hereditary, they've got statues of people going back 145 generations, and we're not even close to the mythological, legendary, divine giving birth to people origin. Blew the mind. So these Greeks, these ancients that are bequeathing to the medievals a whole bunch of writings for them to make sense out of, are saying we ourselves are on this small part of this globe, which is a small part of the cosmos that's marginal, and we can't get to most things. And we're disconnected from most of the past. And we know that because there's even cultures with better historical records, at least, than we have. So this reflects the real difference between the Greek and Egyptian history. Thus, though civilization in most parts of the earth is always comparatively recent, the universe has always existed. Okay, this is his view. If Macrobius describes its formation in terms that which imply time, this must be taken merely as a convenience of discourse. Whatever was purest and most limpid, liquidissimium, liquidissimium, I'm still saying it wrong, liquidissimum, whatever was liquidissimum, whatever was most fluid, rose to the highest place and was called aether. All right, so he's saying temporally, he's using temporal description to say when the world was created, this stuff rose. But his belief is that it's always been this way, and it's always so how so we're describing how it has the form it has, by saying it took its shape a certain way, but that's all understood as metaphor by the author and the audience. That which had less purity, or most of the audience, or the learned audience, of the time, that which had less purity and some small degree of weight became air and sank to the second level, and that which had still some fluidity but was gross enough to offer tactual resistance was gathered together into the stream of water. Finally, out of the whole tumult of matter, all that was irreclaimable, vastum, was scraped off and cleansed from the other elements. Ex defacitus abrasum elementis. That's matter. That's earth. That's the stuff you're made of. It's so the material itself is a marginal thing. We think to ourselves, oh, these medievals thought they were the center of the universe, but we understand that there are galaxies and we're on a speck of dust on a speck of dust. They're saying dust itself is a speck of dust. Matter itself is marginal. Most stuff is dark matter or dark energy, right? They had that idea, and it wasn't dark matter and dark energy like it was like matter or energy. It was a spiritual thing that was so different from what we're made of that we're on the speck of the speck of the speck. Okay, and sank down and settled at the lowest point, plunging and binding in unending cold. All right, we're going to deal with this. Who's sending me messages? Oh, that's good. Of course. Okay. How do we silence this more than all right? The lowest point plunge. All right. So, and that matter. Plunge binding unending cold. Earth is in fact the offscorings of creation, the cosmic dustbin. This passage may also throw light on one in Milton. In Paradise Lost, chapter 7, the sun has just marked out the spherical area of the universe with his golden compass. Then the Spirit of God says, downward purged the black Tartarus cold infernal dregs. Okay. You've got light and space and aether and eternal realms. And then you got a bit of dirty stuff that was sort of like the schmucking blech of creation. And it just sort of like conglomerates. And now you got Earth. Verity takes this to mean that he expelled them from the spherical area, purging them down into chaos, which in Milton, for certain purposes, has an absolute up and down. Down might equally well mean towards the center of the cosmic sphere, and dregs would exactly fit the conception of Macrobius, which is that matter itself is just sort of garbage from creation. To a modern reader, what Macrobius has to say about dreams will seem a not very important item in his commentary. The Middle Ages must have thought differently, since it is clearly to this section that he owes the title Ornicensis or Oracresius, which follows his name in some manuscripts and is there explained as quasi somnorium in iudix or somnori im interpres, the interpreter of dreams, obviously. Both words would be garbled translations of this Greek word. This scheme is derived from the Honora Critica of Artemidorus in the 1st century. According to it, there are 5 species of dreams, 3 veridical and 2 which have no divination. So nothing divine about them. They don't help you, these dreams. There's 2 types. So there's 5 types, 3 are useful, 2 are just sort of weird things. The vertical kinds are as follows. You have somnium. Somnium. This shows us truths veiled in allegorical form. Pharaoh's dream of the fat and lean kine would be a specimen. Every allegorical dream poem in the Middle Ages records a feigned somnium. Nearly all dreams are assumed to be somnia by modern psychologists, and the somnium is the dream in Chaucer's Ode de Fame. Visio, or this Greek word, visio, is the second type of dream. This is a direct, literal prevision of the future. Mr. Dunn's experiment with time is mainly about visiones. This type appears as a vision in Chaucer. Okay, so we've got this transition period. Here's his division of dreams. Hey, look, all through the important literary works, we've got these notions up here. Okay. Oculum, oraculum is the third useful type of dream. And this one The dreamer's parents or some other grave and venerable person appears and openly declares the future or gives advice. Such dreams are Chaucer's oracles. The useless kinds of dreams are insomnium. This merely repeats working preoccupations. The carter dreameth how his cart's goon, as Chaucer says. And visum, or wisdom, this occurs when not yet fully asleep and believing ourselves to be still awake, we see shapes rushing towards us or flitting hither or thither. Epialtes, or nightmare, is included in this class. Chaucer's phantom is clearly the wisdom, and his sweven is presumably an insomnium. This is more likely than the alternative equation, dream for vision and sweven for somnium, in view of the contempt with which Dame per- Pertolote speaks of swevenes in this section. She was a well educated bird and knew both physic and the distichs of Dionysius Cato. A dream may combine the characters of more than one species. Scipio's dream is an oraculum, insofar as a venerable person appears in it to predict and warn of Visio, in so far as it gives literal truths about the celestial regions. A somnium, insofar as it is high and it is in its highest meaning, its altitudo is concealed. To this altitudo we must now turn. Okay, so wow, we got this cool idea. The highest direction. What was this other one here? Oh, yeah, okay. Got it. Cicero, as we've seen, devised a heaven for statesmen. Okay. We saw this in the classical period. He looks no higher than public life and the virtues which that life demands. So you can maybe become immortal if you're a really great statesman. Fine. Hmm. Macrobius brings to the reading of Cicero a wholly different point of view, the mystical, ascetic, world renouncing theology of Neoplatonism. The center of interest for him lies in the purgation of the individual soul, the ascent of the alone to the alone, and nothing could well be more foreign to the mind of Cicero. All right. So here's some new ideas, he says, and they're coming from the classics. This is a pagan, and he's changing the story a bit. Here's what he's concerned with is nothing like what Cicero's concerned with. You might even imagine Cicero is poetically saying you can achieve immortality. You know, this guy is saying, "Oh, wait a minute. Where does your soul go and what does it have to do? And doesn't it have to return somewhere?" And okay, so let's see what he says. This change is Microbius. This change of spiritual atmosphere meets us very early in his commentary. Cicero's feigned somnium could be attacked as Plato's vision of had been attacked on the ground that no species of fiction is becoming to a philosopher. We've seen the opposite in our classes. Macrobius replies by distinguishing different kinds of figmentum. One, so figures, stories, metaphors. One, where all is feigned as in a comedy by Menander. No philosopher would use this. But there's another kind of metaphor where the reader's mind is stimulated to behold some form or appearance of virtues or powers ad quandam virtutum speciem. This may be subdivided into 2A and 2B. Oh boy, are we getting ready to be classical? I mean, sorry, to be medieval, right? To be a scholastic is to say, oh, we can divide, divide, divide. Let's make distinctions. Well, this guy in the transition period, this pagan is starting to be like, now, wait a minute, hold on a second. Don't tell me I can't use metaphor because there's two kinds of metaphor. And the second kind of metaphor could be like this or it could be like this. And we're starting to see some categories where we can, and again, he's hanging out with Christians. So he's a pagan who's trying to hang out with Christians and being buddies with them and developing their theories and their ideas in company with one another. Okay. In 2A, the whole story is feigned, as in Aesop's fables, but in 2B, the argument is grounded in solid truth, but that truth itself is exhibited by means of fictions. Boom. The stories about the gods in Hesiod or Orpheus, which of course Macrobius interpreted allegorically, are examples. The knowledge of holy things is here hidden under a pious veil of figments. Okay, if you thought that medieval or classical man was like reading Ovid's Metamorphosis and going, "Oh, on Tuesday, Apollo was in this physical location, walking over here and said these words," you are way less sophisticated than they were. They're saying, well, the truth is a truth about Hesiod, a truth about Orpheus. But, like, they're not in a place talking at a time, like, that's not what it's like to be a god. That's an allegory, a story to give us a truth. It's a truth. They weren't saying, "Ah, it's just stories." They were saying it's stories, the closest we can get to describing that realm to understand the truth, and the truth is that Hesiod and Orpheus, they said these things, they did these things, but that's it's not meant to be taken literally because they would be like, "Are you dumb? Like, do you not understand that we're talking about something beyond our realm here?" So that's the way these people are thinking about this stuff. And if you're on X thinking, I mean, I saw so many, you can see so many people who think today, like, I've just debunked the Bible. I found a literal contradiction. If I read the story like a moron, checkmate, Christians. And it's like, oh, you're not reading as intelligently as even I think a layperson who could appreciate the poetry of somebody, like, it's just it's embarrassing. This last is the only sort which philosophy admits. Okay, so he says, look, philosophy can have a story like that too. A story where I'm telling you a truth, but I'm using a fiction in order to illustrate what that truth is. And notice that's not the same as saying it's a fiction. Like they on the theological level, they're saying, no, Hesiod's real. I believe in Hesiod. I just you understand it's not a body. You understand it's not a thing like what I am. What I am is like a shadow of the reality. Right. So like, oh, how did Jupiter get from here to here? It's like, do you not understand what we're talking about? Would be the response. I mean, I think they wouldn't debate you. They wouldn't be like, oh, what a challenge to my theology. They'd be like, who let the moron in the room? Like, stick around and listen for a while and you'll start to understand what we're talking about, would probably be the response. But no, it does not admit even this on all of its themes. It will treat thus of the soul or of the aerial or the ethereal beings or of the other gods, but the license to feign extend no further. Philosophy would never use this method when speaking, quote, of God the highest and first of all things, whom the Greeks call the good, the arche, the first cause. Whoa, bah, 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 pause. Oh, the pagans believe in all these deities, but the Christians have only one God with a bunch of angels and demons. What? Hold on. What is this pagan saying? He's saying we're using metaphor in philosophy to talk about the soul and things like that. We can do that. Philosophy, though, on this level would never use this method of metaphor when speaking of the actual God. There's really one God. There's really a prime mover who started it all. These other demigods, these are like we're far away from him. So humbly, we're using many transitional stages before we just imagine that we could talk about that. They're monotheists and they're using the phrase the first cause. And we've seen in our video on Aristotle, the reason why we're reading this, this is in the Aquinas class on the Summa Theologica. We're reading through the Summa Theologica and we're reading Aquinas's argument that there must be a first cause and why. And he's quoting Aristotle. The Christians and the pagans were more like each other than either of them are like you if you're on Twitter. Or of mind, whom the Greeks call nous, which, or vous, which is the offspring of and procession of the highest, wherein dwell the archetypal forms of things, which are called ideas. We're not even to 500 AD yet. We have are you starting to see? We're hoping that this is blowing my mind, but we're hoping to open up our eyes to be like, "Oh, wait, there's a whole bunch of texts here, and they're not from some alien culture that believe crazy, stupid things. I might be the alien culture that believes crazy, stupid things, and the ideas that work for me that created my culture might have actually been understood directly by these people more than they are by me, and what the heck? This is kinda mind-blowing. We have here a chasm between the divine and all merely creaturely beings, so the created, right? There's a difference between the creator and the created, and that is as fundamental a difference as spirit and matter, any two opposites. And so obviously the pagans have a whole bunch of deities in between and demigods and granddaughter gods and grandson gods and multi-generations of gods and spiritual messenger gods and like and what do the Christians have? They've got God, this thing that you can't really speak properly about. It's way out there. And they've got us. And what do they have? They've got a bunch of angels and demons and messengers and stuff. It's like, okay, what's the difference? Well, if you say, well, that sounds like an analogy, you might think you're just whitewashing it and saying they're the same thing. But when you hear the way the pagans are describing the very nature and function of why the demigods and the gods exist, which is not the highest real God, why those things exist at all, it's exactly explicitly being described as a transitional way of communicating to dumb matter what spiritual truths are. So it's not just, hey, it's an analogy. There's a lot of things over here. There's a lot of things over here. Maybe that's the same idea. That's not what's happening. It's explicitly by the philosophical and theological developers of the ideas, explicitly, this necessarily must be the thing we can understand that's not really the ultimate real truth. Is your mind being blown? Is your mind being blown? My mind is being blown. Is your mind being blown because you've been lied to your entire life and you've got wealths of riches in text that you've never read and everybody's giving you reasons why you shouldn't have to? We might want to dive into this. We're going to. Between the divine and all merely creaturely beings, however exalted, a sheer transcendence which earlier paganism and especially Roman paganism had never dreamed of. The word gods in this system is simply not the plural of God. There is a difference in kind, even in incommensurability. Okay. There's a distinction between the demigods and God that's like almost impossible to bridge between them, as there is between the holiness of the holy things, sacra, shadowed forth in Orpheus and Hesiod, and that holiness which Macrobius, though he does not use the word, so obviously feels when he thinks of the first cause. Yeah, you can. Thank you, C.S. Lewis, for being literarily awake enough to detect that in the text, right? You can feel it. Literature, you can feel the way he's talking about the first cause. And it's like, ooh, paganism here becomes, in the full sense, religious mythology and philosophy have both been transmuted into theology. We're not even to 500 AD yet. We're looking at the writings of a pagan who's friends with Christians and developing their the spiritual concepts of paganism in this transitional zone. The God and mind mentioned in the last paragraph are, of course, the first two members or persons or moments of that Neoplatonic Trinity, which is at once so like and so unlike the Christian. God de sementem crevit, creoit, the creator, created mind out of himself. So God out of himself creates mind, like a father-son situation. A Christian would probably be ill-advised to give creawit a sense that could be opposed to begot. The words out of himself discourage the Nicene distinction, begotten, not created. Why does that discourage? Because out of himself sounds more like begotten and not created, doesn't it? Oh, he's saying, yeah, but pay more attention to the poetry of the pagans. That's not what the distinction they were trying to make there. And creare in Latin is freely used of sexual generation. This mens is the nous of Bernardus Silvestris. As soon as Microbius begins to describe mens, He reveals a profound difference between Neoplatonism and Christianity. Insofar as Mens contemplates her parent, she preserves the full likeness of her author. But when she looks back at things behind her, she creates out of herself anima or soul. The second person of the Christian Trinity is the Creator, the provident wisdom and creative will of the Father in action. The idea that he became less one with or turned away from the Father by creating would be repugnant to Christian theology. That's true. In men's, on the other hand, creation is almost a sort of infirmity. She becomes less like God by creating, declines into creation only because she turns her gaze away from her origin and looks back. The next step is the same. As for so thank you, C.S. Lewis, for being this careful in trying to divide things up. Got very, very sharp distinctions between this Neoplatonic Trinity, first two persons, and the Christian one. Zoom back out to a modern atheistic scientismist or a person who just sort of thinks they're Christian but doesn't think about any of these things. This pagan and this Christian are the same person compared to you. You're way more different. You're way different from both of them. Okay. But this is interesting. As long as anima fixes oh wait, turns her back on the next step is the same. As long as anima fixes her attention on mens, she puts on the nature of mens, but gradually, as her contemplation withdraws, she sinks degenerate. Okay, so it's like God is degenerating into creation with this version, though herself incorporeal to the making of bodies. Okay, I get it. That is how so like that pure divinity for the pagans is so pure that the act of creation itself is a less than divine thing, and God has to sort of give birth to lesser God that's still the same God Trinity, but is intention to look away from himself at something else. And, you can understand the spiritual and theological impetus for that. And saying, like, even just to condescend to do creation itself, the true God above all gods had to become lesser, is how the mythological story and maybe the theological story is going. Okay. Though herself incorporeal the making of bodies. That is how nature comes into existence. Thus, from the very beginning, where Christianity sees creation, Neoplatonism sees, if not exactly a fall, yet a series of declinations, diminutions, almost of inconsistencies. The universe seeps, as it were, into existence at those moments, for we can talk only in temporal language. Remember, the people writing this and understanding it understood that this was described temporally because there's no other way for us to describe something. It was believed to be describing a actual truth, but it wasn't believed that we could understand that truth beyond in a literal way without metaphor. And the metaphor itself is that through time this is happening. They knew that it wasn't through time that this was happening. I mean, you can see even in the mythopoetics that the stories of the origins of time are in the stories. Ovid and stuff. Anyway, when mind is not perfectly waiting upon God, nor soul upon mind, so there's a divine trinity in the pagan view. They didn't just have a God above all the other gods who was the real monotheistic God, he was a trinity. Nothing else is created, nothing else exists until that trinity develops in time, but this is an eternal being, so it's not developing in time, but they understand that we're using metaphor to describe the nature of a three-person oneness that is in relationship to itself. And the only way from the Neoplatonic view that creation can be done at all is actually a divorce, a little bit of a breaking, a little bit of a, well, I've had enough time contemplating myself as awesomely, perfectly pure. I'll look towards making of things. That's not a Christian notion, but it is a pagan notion. We must not, however, press this too far. Even on these terms, the glory, fulgur of God illumines the whole world, as one face fills many mirrors placed in due order. Unquote. So you remember, he's just effortlessly quoting poetry to make these points. Dante uses this image in Paradiso. We should look that up, but it's not copied there. All this, I suspect, would have interested Cicero very little. Certainly, Macrobius, thinking such thoughts, cannot be content with an ethic and an eschatology centered on civic life. Here, therefore, occurs one of those amazing tour de force to which syncretism is driven by its determination to find in all old texts what its own age accepts as wisdom. Cicero, explaining his statesman's heaven, had said that nothing, any way that goes on earth, quodquidem in terris fiat, is more pleasing to God than those councils and communities of men bound together by law, which we call commonwealths. Politics is the highest humanity can achieve, according to Cicero. Now we've got pagan spiritualism coming in and saying, really? Well, not so sure about that, buddy. What Cicero meant by this parenthetical reservation, I am not sure. Probably he was distinguishing earthly affairs from the motions of the heavenly bodies, which God would undoubtedly prize more highly. But Macrobius regards this saving clause as Cicero's way of leaving room for a whole system of ethics, which Cicero might have strongly repudiated. All right. So as he's trying to make sense and fit all these things together, he's saying, oh, look, you gave me room. There's nothing on earth more important than politics, but it's not all just earth. Why not? So, hey, yeah, what if we cared about this stuff more? Okay. A system which is religious, not secular, individual, not social, occupied not with the outer, but with the inner life. He accepts the classical quaternion of virtues. The classical one is prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice, right? We've got courage, we've got uh, prudence is a good word for it. We've got temperance and we've got justice. But he adds that they all exist on four different levels, and on each level, their names have different meanings. Everybody remembers Plato here. On the lowest or political level, they mean what we should expect. The next level is the purgatorial. Up there, prudence means to contemplate divine matters with contempt of the world and all that it contains. Temperance is translated on this realm into to renounce so far as nature permits all things that the body requires, and justice to accept the practice of all the virtues as the only road to the good. Fortitude on this level is not so easily grasped. It enjoins that the soul be not terrified when, yeah, I can imagine it would be that on this level, actually. Why is that hard to grasp? Go into this. Fortitude would be something like going through the valley of the shadow of death and keeping your eye on the divine and making it through to the other side, burning up and being reborn. I mean, you can imagine what that would be. Anyway, led by philosophy, she recedes in a manner from the body and may feel no shudder at the height of the perfect ascent. Okay, so the way he puts it is, all right, differently than what I was thinking. Okay, so what he says is, look, on earth, you've got prudence, you've got justice, you've got temperance, you've got fortitude. Awesome. Those are the virtues of a man living a terrestrial life. But now there's this spiritual realm. And if you're going to try to engage in spiritual enlightenment, you still have those four virtues, but they mean something slightly different. And the last one we're going to talk about what it means is fortitude. And what it means is as you're actually accomplishing this separation from the dumb material stuff that used to define you into the spiritual realm, be not afraid of having let go of that earthly stuff. It's the courage to just sort of shed the body and be like, yeah, I'm not afraid to enter this woo spiritual realm because I've always been so tactile things make me feel more at peace. No, 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 no. As you do these other things with these other virtues and you advance in this way, let's let go of the body. And obviously, without mentioning it, Plato is coming to mind over and over and over again here, right? Not just contempt of the body, But um, that philosophy is what's being used to do this. So it's all an intellectual practice of some sort. So the distinction between intellectual and spiritual is we got to find out where that line is. But also that the philosophy is the study of how to die. Okay. And so you're letting go of the body and you're going to, you're practicing that if you're doing philosophy. This is based on Phaedo. Hey, Plato's showing up. Okay. Never mind. He mentions it. It's right there. Okay. On the third level, and we read some of the Phaedo the other day for other reasons as well. On the third level, which is that of souls already purified, prudence means no longer to prefer divine things, but to take no account at all of any others. Temperance means not to deny, but wholly to forget earthly desires. Fortitude means not to conquer the passions, but to be ignorant of their very existence. And justice, to be so linked with that higher and divine mind that one keeps an inviolable pact with her by imitation of her. Again, very much like Plato, right? We're going to get to know the beauty qua beauty and truth qua truth and the arche, the source of all things. We're going to know it personally so that it reflects in us and that we can see what is reflective of it here and make right judgments on this realm of this is actually beautiful, this is actually ugly rather than the reverse because we know beauty itself. And it's all being done in the mind, and so there's this notion of the mental that's going on in this Platonic pagan understanding of spiritualism. There remains the fourth level. So now we're going to a fourth level. So we go, all right. So you're on the terrestrial level, be courageous, keep to your word, be prudent, don't get drunk a lot. That's your earthly political life. Then there's this next level, like, okay, fast a bit and give up some things and start worrying about stuff that's not physical and material and transcend. And then we get to this next level where it's like, okay, give it up entirely. Don't even be worried about it. Okay, fine, become ignorant of the very passions themselves. And then there's the fourth level. With mens revus itself dwell the four archetypal virtues. These are the virtues. So your original virtues of be courageous and be honest and those types of things, those are shadows of shadows of shadows of what's really real. What's really real as you make this spiritual journey to get to the virtues, the archetypal virtues, virtuous exemplares, the real thing, the transcendent forms, whereof the four on the lower levels, there you go, are shadows. Apparently, it was to leave room for all this that Cicero wrote the 5 words, quod quidem in terris fiat. Unlike Cicero, Macrobius believes that the soul can return to heaven because she first came thence, that the body is the soul's tomb, that the soul is the man, and that each single star is larger than the earth. All right, so he's just citing things in his poetry that show, like, all right, you're on a journey of a valley through the shadow of death. It's called your life. It's called being on earth, and you came from the divine, and back there you should be trying to get. Virtue is going to lead you there. If you do philosophy properly and your spiritual practices properly, you'll get back there. Now, notice how similar the pagan perspective is to the Christian perspective and the important differences. We're not whitewashing the important differences, but we're also saying, okay, these serious spiritual pagans are not dancing naked in the woods going, I like river goddesses who have titties. And the Christians are, these guys are doing the exact same project as closely as they possibly can. They're friends with each other. They're disagreeing about certain things, but they're trying to get to the one true God through all the illusions. They have so many of the same concepts that the average religious person today, even a serious religious person today, well, let's say the average religious person today has less in common with either of them than they have with each other. Okay. Like Cicero, Macrobius believes that the soul can return to heaven because this sort of came. All right, and that the earth. Okay, fine. Unlike most authorities, however, he denies that the stars produce terrestrial events. Ooh, he's got a change here. Though they may, by their relative positions, enable us to predict them. Okay, now this is interesting because it used to be okay, these realms of authority are influencing Earth. And it used, and One view is that's why they're there. That's no good. The next view is they're incidentally influencing Earth. He's going to say that it's not even to produce events on Earth. Let's see if it even happens. Oh, wait, that's the end of the section. Okay. Unlike most authorities, he denies that the stars produce terrestrial events. Okay. So the disconnect between the higher realms of spiritual authority and excellence, in one view, oh, those things are echoing down and they're doing things to affect things on Earth. In the serious spiritual pagan and Christian transitional period, early Christian view, it's like the idea has been introduced that actually incidentally it's affecting things on Earth, but that's not why they exist. And then Macrobius is saying, no, no, that stuff doesn't have any effect on this. You can predict, you need to catch up to it. It's doing something. You're astray. You're wandering astray. You need to figure out what it's up to so that you can, maybe you can predict things based on what's likely to happen, but not because that realm is even affecting this realm. All right. Puts us even further on the margin spiritually. Okay. Let's get to, we're going to try to finish chapter 4 here. Let's get to the next individual in the inter-transitional period that we're looking at here. Let's see if we, uh, okay, so remember we're looking at C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image. Right now, in this chapter, we're looking at the transitional period from the classical to the medieval, and we're trying to understand through poetry and literature what the average everyday person about um, thought about the cosmos and thought about themselves and thought about physics and thought about the world. And we're learning quite a lot of interesting things. And now we've done two sources. We're going to look at a third right now. Okay. Pseudo Dionysius. In the Middle Ages. Oh, if you're enjoying this and you want to come and join us on X is the only place we're streaming, and there's a link that you can click on, and your picture will show up here or your avatar. If you're on a phone and you're trying to do it, you kind of have to scroll down extra far just to hit a third confirm button or something like that. But feel free to come join us. Um, okay, that's good advice. Huh. Let's do this really briefly. I'm going to click a button. Gonna click a button and our short break is over. Let's continue. Okay, on to the next source in this project of ours. Oops, remove that, add that. Groovy, baby. Pseudo Dionysius. In the Middle Ages, four books: the celestial hierarchies, the ecclesiastical hierarchies, the divine names, and the mystical theology were attributed to that Dionysius who was converted by hearing St. Paul's address to the Areopagus. Okay, that's quite interesting. That's a great story, by the way. It would be nice to do a little. We talk about that story often when we're doing philosophy. Anyway, he was one of the few who was like, "Hey, Paul seems to have the answers," and then he went and wrote these four amazing books. Okay, this attribution was disproved in the 16th century. Bunch of myth, nothing to do with that, but okay. The real author is thought to have lived in Syria, and he must have written sometime before 533 when his works were quoted at the Council of Constantinople. He was Latinized by John Scotus Erigena, who died about 870. His writings are usually regarded as the main channel by which a certain kind of theology entered the Western tradition. It is the negative theology. We actually just talked about this as we got into our Aquinas class. I did another Aquinas class before we finished doing this C.S. Lewis stuff. So class 12, we got to the simplicity of God, on of the simplicity of God. That was a heck of a lecture. And one of the concepts we had to look at was this idea of you can't say positive things about God and be accurate because words are definitive and they limit things. So therefore, What if we did negative talk about God? What if we said God is not a body and we got rid of all of our faulty ideas of God in order to try to get our minds to approach a more true concept? All right, is negative theology of those who take in a more rigid sense and emphasize more persistently than others the incomprehensibility of God. It is already well rooted in Plato himself, as we see from the Republic and the Second Epistle, and central in Plotinus. Its most striking representative in English is the cloud of unknowing. Some German Protestant theology in our own time and some theistic existentialism has perhaps a remote affinity with it. Remember, if you want to join on camera, just click on the link underneath the video. But this, though the most important thing about Pseudo Dionysius, is not the one that concerns us. It is by his angelology that he contributed to the model. And we can therefore confine our attention to his celestial hierarchies. So we're just going to look at that one. All right. So remember, we're looking at the medievals as taking a bunch of sources from Plato and Aristotle and Greek sources, Germanic sources. Germanic sources and Judeo sources and Arabic sources, and saying, okay, we've got all of these ideas. How do we make them all fit into one system and model? And so we're going to look here at what gets revised about our concepts of the cosmos by this author's angelology. Our author differs from all earlier and some later authorities by declaring the angels to be pure minds, just minds, unembodied. In art, to be sure, they are represented as corporeal pro captu nostro, as a concession to our capacity. And so in art, we say they have a body, just like we say the arm of God is long, but we understand God doesn't have a body. He doesn't have like a physical arm. That's their understanding, as we've seen. Um, you can go to video 12 in the classes, but that poetically we're describing it this way because agency and the metaphor and literary. So this individual is going to show up and say, you know what, the angels are like that too. Just like these pagans are talking about these mental, spiritual, non-physical, aether, refined bodies and things that are not like this coarse matter. The angels are like that too. But he's going to say they're pure minds, unembodied. So they don't even have a weird analogy to a body. In art, you can depict them as having bodies to describe what's going on, but they're just mind and mind alone. Now, remember, we're in the milieu of interacting with pagans who basically, for them, mind is as close to an idea of spiritual as you can get to. It's like if it's pure mind, that's the spiritual realm. That's not true of the Christian, but this is a Christian author who's saying angels are just mind. So you see all of the sharing of concepts between these two camps and the tensions and trying to work it out. So let's see what he does. In art, to be sure, they are represented as corporeal okay, we know. And such symbolism, he adds, is not degrading, for even matter deriving its existence from the true beauty has in the fashion of all its parts some traces of beauty and worth. Okay. It's okay to use that metaphor because remember, even the pagans understood we're not talking about Zeus, we're talking about something beyond that. We're talking about the God, and that God was a trinity for both of them. This statement in a book, which came to be so authoritative, may be taken as proof that educated people in the Middle Ages never believed the winged men who represent angels in painting and sculpture to be more than symbols. Okay. You've got a painting of an angel, and people are looking at it and they're getting meaning out of it. And they're saying, remember, this is who we are, and this is how the cosmos works. And these are the sort of spiritual forces involved. But the people who invented the concept of the angel understood it wasn't a physical entity. Okay. So the idea that we say, oh, these medieval people, they believe in all these entities, and oh, is the angel here? Is the angel here? You have to have a body to have a location, you moron. Like that's what any thoughtful person, any literary person from the medieval or even the classical, we're not even to 500 AD right now. Any thoughtful person talking about any of these things would say bodies have locations, you dummy. The angel, it's I'm not saying literally the angel was here and then he walked over here. That's a property of bodies, as we've seen in Aquinas, that they're using that type of reasoning to define the essence of what body or mind actually means. So the people it's not like, "Oh, we used to believe in aliens, but now we believe that they're clever metaphors and stories because we don't wanna give up our precious ideas." No, it's not like a bunch of scientism, materialist atheists came in and bashed us over the head to say, "You believe in stupid things that are just ooh." These are the inventions of the ideas. These are the developments of the notion of angel itself. And we're not agreeing or disagreeing with his take on it. But the point is, none of these people who are taking these ideas seriously have anything like the sort of cartoon views that a Twitter atheist might be like, duh, how dumb are you? Like, it doesn't apply. It's just who are you talking to? You're talking to a cartoon version of your dumb type of reading of something like this. Nobody who wrote it or read it or cared about it for centuries thought about it that way. All right, this statement in a book which came maybe no one is too extreme, all right, but pretty close. No one's serious. Came to be so authoritative. Maybe no one's serious is too much too. It was very rare that anybody would think of it that way, and if they did, they thought of it in the milieu of having to justify thinking of it in that way, not just taking for granted like, "Duh, Zeus is over there." Nobody was ever like that, even in classical times. Okay. May be taken as proof that the educated people in the Middle Ages never believed the winged men who represented angels in painting and sculptures to be more than symbols. It was Pseudo Dionysius whose arrangement of the angelic creatures into what Spencer calls their trinal triplicities into three hierarchies containing three species each was finally accepted by the church. The first hierarchy contains the three species: seraphim, cherubim, and thrones. These are the creatures closest to God. Now remember, he's not teaching us about the angel realm. We're studying how did medieval man think about these things. Well, guess what? Man is divided into three. The cosmos is divided into three. There's God and there's matter and there's spirit and matter and there's God and earth and God and man and the divine and the aether and the sky versus and then there's got to be a transition zone. Well, we examine man as the intelligent creature in the terrestrial realm and we discover he's got rationality and he's got impulse and he also has stomachal appetitive needs. And so there's a triune divinity. All right, guess what? They went to study the angels and they said, hey, guess what? There's a high level and a low level and a middle level in between. Let's see what they discover. The first hierarchy contains the three species: seraphim, cherubim, and thrones. These are the creatures closest to God. They face him, nullis interrectu, like interceding, with nothing between, with nullis intersectu. It's like the highest level of angel. God's here, they're here, boom, direct contact. So originally we had God, Earth, and you had the daemons in the middle for transition. Well, if you divide that up, you get the highest level there, right like boom, God. I'm experiencing him directly, nothing in between. Encircling him with their ceaseless dance. Okay. The names of seraph and throne are both associated with this author and ideas of heat or burning, a characteristic well known to the poets. Hence, Chaucer's Somnor had a fire-reed cherubim's face. And it was not only for rhyme's sake that Pope wrote the rapt seraph that adores and burns. All right. You're right up next to the biggest divine fire if you're in the highest realm of angel. The second hierarchy contains this Greek word, dominations, the dominions, the dominations, potentates, right? Potestates, potentates, or powers, and the virtues. Okay, so we've got three types here: dominations, powers, and virtues. This does not mean moral excellences, but rather aphases, as when we speak about the virtues of a magic ring or a medicinal herb. Okay. Impulsive powers, like in our stupid time, we have these ideas of force and field, and like you've got gravitational and electromagnetic forces. Those words are filler words for scientists, which means this is where I stop being curious. That like at this point, just accept that word because I'm not going to ask any more questions. That's the God of the gap that they're using. The word doesn't actually mean anything. In this theology, what they say is maybe you could take those notions and say they live in this middle realm of the middle realm where it's like, I'm not saying that that's what they were trying to do, but I'm saying the concept should be something more like that, where it's like, how is this thing pulling on something? How is it pushing on something? There's like forces and powers involved, and maybe they're personified, maybe they're actually psychological forces. But when they say virtues, they don't mean right ways of behaving or aiming towards the right things. They're talking about what gives something like, okay, so this medicine causes this to happen in you when you take it. Well, there's a bit of that power. There's some of that realm in here, maybe. Okay, I don't know. I'm not an expert on this, but we're going to see how the medievals thought about all this. The activity of both of these hierarchies is directed towards God. Okay, so both those realms are aimed towards the divine. They stand, so to speak, with their faces to him and their backs to us. In the third and lowest hierarchy, we at last find creatures who are concerned with man. It contains princedoms or principalities or princes, archangels, and angels. The word angel is thus both a generic name for all the nine species contained in the three hierarchies and also a specific name for the lowest, as sailor in English sometimes includes all seafaring persons and is sometimes confined only to those who birth forward. Okay? Princedoms are the guardians and patrons of nations, so that theology names Michael the Prince of Jews. The scriptural source of this in Daniel 12:1 if Dryden had written his Arthuriad, these creatures would now be better known for he intended to use them as his machines. They are Milton's angels precedent in every province, and Thomas Brown's provincial guardians. The two remaining species, archangels and angels, are the angels of popular tradition and beings that appear to human individuals. So they're basically the only species that we're even really have in our sight anymore at this point. Notice nothing we're saying here is endorsing or criticizing any of these views. I'm not saying this is, hey, you should know that there's 9 levels of angels in hierarchy. I'm also not saying that you should throw that idea out for no reason either. The reason why the thinkers developed those ideas, there's actual reasons for that. We're not studying that here. We're studying literature to see how did the layperson think about the different realms in the cosmos at this time. Um, so that's our purpose here. But we're neither endorsing nor criticizing these views. We're trying to comprehend them. We're trying to understand them accurately and describe them and understand what they really meant to them and not just what they seem to mean to us when we read about it. They are indeed the only superhuman beings that do so. For Pseudo Dionysius is as certain as Plato or Apuleius that God encounters man only through a means. So this is some of the reasoning why they were as they're trying to make sense of all these things, they've got some rationality here to say, like, yo, if this really is different than this, how can there be communication between the two? It's different. Okay, well, we need a mean, we need a median between the two to make sense that this is a thing that's half like that and half like this, if they're really fundamentally different. So, so let's see. And reads in his own philosophy into scripture as freely as Chalcidius has read into his into the Timaeus. Okay, so we're seeing two examples now where you kind of got your own ideas, but you're kind of putting them on things that are more ancient. So notice how careful C.S. Lewis is here to say this classical idea exists here. This one has been translated differently. This one was being critiqued this way. He's not allowing anybody to whitewash anything, and he's being very careful in this analysis. He cannot deny that theophanies, direct appearances of God himself to patriarchs and prophets, that's theophanies, seem to occur in the Old Testament, but he is quite sure that this never really happens. These visions were in reality mediated through celestial but created beings, as though the order of the divine law laid it down that creatures of a lower order should be moved Godward by those of a higher. Okay. So his explanation is, look, we already know a lot of this is metaphor. That doesn't make it not true. It's just pointing at a truth that you can't describe in any other way. And I'm pretty sure from my philosophy, from my theology, from my rigorous study here and application of the principles, that you've got to have an intermediary to communicate between these two realms. That the order of the divine law does so enjoin is one of his key conceptions. His God does nothing directly that can be done through an intermediary, perhaps prefers the longest possible chain of intermediaries, it seems sometimes when we're reading him, devolution or delegation. A finely graded descent of power and goodness is the universal principle. Okay. God's glory is contained in the fact that he can make the most number of dominoes perfectly translate to different layers that are far away from his divine glory exactly what it is that he needs to communicate to them. Something like that is in the notion of this author as he's thinking about these things. The divine splendor illustratio comes to us filtered, as it were, through the hierarchies. This explains why even a message of such cosmic moment as the Annunciation, even to so exalted a person as Mary, was brought by an angelic being, and even by a mere archangel, a member of the lowest species but one. Angels were first shown the divine mystery, and afterwards the grace of knowing it reached us through them. Unquote. On this point, Aquinas, centuries later, quotes Pseudo Dionysius and confirms him. The thing was done thus for several reasons, but among them, that even in so great a matter, in hoc etiam, the system or pattern or ordinatio, whereby divine things reached us through the mediation of angels, might be unbroken. Unquote. By a tour de force comparable to that which Macrobius performed when he made Cicero into a good Neoplatonist, our author finds his principle confirmed in Isaiah. There, the seraphim are crying to one another, Holy, holy, holy. Why to one another rather than to the Lord? Obviously, because each angel is incessantly handing on his knowledge of God to the angels next below him in rank. It is, of course, a transforming, not a merely speculative knowledge. Each busily makes his colleagues images of God, bright mirrors. Unquote. In Pseudo Dionysius, the whole universe becomes a fugue, which the triad, agent, mean, patient, is the subject. The total angelic creation is a mean between God and man, and that in two senses. It is a dynamic mean as God's executive, but it is also a mean as a lens is a mean. For the celestial hierarchies are revealed to us in order that the ecclesiastical hierarchy on earth may imitate as nearly as possible their divine service and office. Source of all things, what we need to know about it, coming through me, everything in creation is echoing downwards, the closest can see of it into an image that the next layer can see and understand. We're just below the angels in that. And the second hierarchy is doubtless a mean between the first and the third. And in each hierarchy, the central species is a mean. And in each individual angel, as in each individual man, there are ruling and intermediary and obedient faculties. Okay. This goes down all the way. The angels that are closest to God, looking at him, are shouting at each other, Holy, holy, holy. They're communicating to each other what's true about the divine, and they're the ones that are on the top layer of the top layer of angelic type beings, not called angels, right? Then there's a layer below them and a layer below them. They make up the top higher of the top third. They're communicating to each other as they get further and further away from the throne. The message of God's glory is being shouted in ways that can be translated betwixt those realms. Eventually, you get to the next layers, three of them. The next layers, three of them. The bottom one of those are the angels as we know them. They're the only ones that are actually looking at us, even though they're getting their knowledge from these things that are looking at the divine, and they're communicating directly with us. We look up there. So this mediation looks just like the different zones of authority in the cosmic story of the classics. It looks concave when you're looking up, and it looks convex when you're looking down. There's an orientation difference. There's a message shouting feature if you're above something down to the below, and there's a using a lens to be able to see something that's not of the nature of your realm. That is the quality of mediation looking up. Okay, we've got the story. The spirit of this scheme, though not every detail, is strongly present in the medieval model. Okay, so again, we're looking at the before 500 AD, and now we're going to start to see how the medievals have a lot of this idea from Pseudo Dionysius in their in the Christian conception that's developed in that era. And we've already seen him quote Aquinas on that. And if the reader will suspend his disbelief and exercise his imagination upon it, even for a few minutes, I think he will become aware of the vast readjustment involved in a perceptive reading of the old poets. He will find his whole attitude to the universe inverted. In modern, that is, in evolutionary thought, man stands at the top of a stair whose foot is lost in obscurity. In this, he stands at the bottom of a stair whose top is invisible with light. One of the funny things, let's keep reading. He will also understand that something beside individual genius, that, of course, helped to give Dante's angels their unrivaled majesty. Milton, aiming at that, missed the target. Classicism has come in between. His angels have too much anatomy and too much armor, are too much like the gods of Homer and Virgil, and for that very reason, far less like the gods of paganism in its highest religious development. After Milton, total degradation sets in, and we finally reach the purely consolatory, hence, waterishly feminine angels of 19th century art. Holy mackerel. So there's a development that happens here. This was one hell of a paragraph. He keeps ending his sections with paragraphs, so it's like, whoa. Okay, so we've got a clear picture of this model of these pagans and Christians, early Christians and Platonic pagans before the 500s, and their picture of spirituality is like what we've been describing. What happens to the angels as we develop through the ages? Well, pause. Have you ever heard modern people say, "Oh, those silly religious people, they thought they were the center of everything." Now we know that we're just like all the other animals and we're related to all the other animals and our origin is something we don't even know about. It's in the dark past of nothingness and maybe accidents and lucky happenstance and order from, natural selection and principles like that have, which is different than random, but have come together to allow us to produce something as crowning an achievement as the intellect and sophisticated consciousness of man. That's our story. And then we look back and laugh. Oh, those medievals, those classical ancient people, the Renaissance writers, they thought there was a God who cared about them. Don't you understand? We're just matter. That's all there is. Well, wait a minute. You're putting yourself at the crowning of everything when you're saying it's all just matter. They're saying it's not all just matter. Matter is almost like the garbage of creation. There's all this invisible stuff that you don't even know about that's more real and doesn't change, and it goes from absolute awesomeness to all these layers down to where we are. And so we mock them and we go, "Oh, look at they thought, oh, you're the center of the universe." They go, "I'm not the center of the universe. I'm absolutely not anywhere near the center of the universe. I'm as close to hell as possible, actually. Hell's just a little bit lower than where I am." And so at the same time, you have these modern materialists who think they're superior because they don't have an anthropocentric view. But there's quite a lot of material pride in their story, and some of the insults just you have to imagine a very cartoonish version of what the ancients and the medievals thought in order to think that that's a legitimate criticism. Um, Because notice the criticism that's coming from them is not, "Oh, this is factually not what happened." They make those criticisms too. We can have those conversations. We already understand that the ancients and medievals knew how to think scientifically and also understood when they were doing storytelling about their place in the cosmos and that they could hold both of those at the same time. So we can talk about that, but that's not the type of criticism I'm talking about. I'm talking about these people who think they're not spiritualists and that they're not religious, getting all puffed up with, I have a better way of thinking because I am not so arrogant as to think God would care about a man. And it's like, wait a minute. Actually, you think your consciousness is the most divine thing that exists, and it's actually in you. And these people are much more humble than that and saying, I have to go through 4 layers of human development before I can really even be at the foot of where the angelic realm starts. And that's 9 layers lower than where the thing that actually is in connection with the divine is. And that is an idea that is shared in conception with the pagans who said, yeah, this Zeus thing is sort of in one of those layers. It's not the real divine that we're after. So I'm talking about the people who think they're not religious, but who are using very moralistic, spiritualistic, their spirits are all up in upheaval as they say, oh, how bad of you to be so self centered and anthropocentric. Okay, Boethius. Let's see if we can finish this chapter. The next transition period thinker that we're always not sure, are they Christian or pagan sometimes? This last one we knew was Christian. We're going to look at Boethius now, 430 to 524 AD. After Plotinus, the greatest author of the seminal period, his De Consol. I think this is probably a good time for a break, actually. Um, let's go ahead and see here. It's quite impressive to watch C.S. Lewis use all these quotations from poetry and stuff. Be like, this is how they thought about things. Um, this book is blowing my mind more now than the last time I looked at it, which was many years ago. Um, and I didn't remember most of the most important points in this book, so I'm glad we're getting a chance to read this. Okay, so the last of the 4 that we're going to look at in this transition period is Boethius. And so we will take a break and come back in 5 minutes to do that. A short break. I'm not going to end the video. I'll be right back. Ba-dum bum bum bum. Pum pa bum pum pum pum. Get your cup, your mug, your glass, your tank, your chalice, thermos, or stein, your canteen jug or flask. Hurry. Your vessel of any kind. Fill it with your favorite liquid. I like water today. And join us all together in the dopamine hit of the day, the thing that makes everything better. It's called the simultaneous sip, and it happens right now. Ooh. Oh, that's some good stuff. Okay, let's wrap up this chapter here. Boethius, after Plotinus, the greatest author of the seminal period, and his De Consolatione Philosophiae was for centuries one of the most influential books ever written in Latin. It was translated into Old High German, Italian, Spanish, and Greek, into French by Jean de Meung, into English by Alfred Chaucer, Elizabeth I, and others. Until about 200 years ago, it would, I think, have been hard to find an educated man in any European country who did not love it. Not just read it, know about it, love it. To acquire a taste for it is almost to become naturalized to the Middle Ages. Thanks, C.S. Lewis. If we're trying to be introduced into the way the medievals thought, if you want to actually just enter their country and maybe even become a citizen of the Middle Ages, read this book. It's pointing us in the right direction. Boethius. I think we know the next thing we'll read way later, but as a thing. All right. Boethius, scholar and aristocrat, was a minister to Theodoric the Ostrogoth, the first barbarian king in Italy, and an Arian by religion, though no persecutor. As always, the word barbarian might mislead. Though Theodoric was illiterate, he had passed his youth in high Byzantine society. He was in some ways a better ruler than many Roman emperors had been. His reign in Italy was not a sheer monstrosity as, say, the rule of Chaka or Dingan in 19th century England would have been. It was more as if a Popish Highland chieftain who had acquired a little Polish and a taste for claret in the French service had reigned over the partly Protestant and partly skeptical England of Johnson and Lord Chesterfield. It is not, however, surprising that the Roman aristocracy were soon caught intriguing with the Eastern emperor in the hope of delivering themselves from this alien. Boethius, whether justly or not, fell under suspicion. He was imprisoned in Pavia. Presently, they twisted ropes round his head till his eyes dropped out and finished him off with a bludgeon. Didn't have a great end there. Now, Boethius was undoubtedly a Christian and even a theologian. His other works bear titles like De Trinitate and De Fide Catholica, okay, the universal faith. But the philosophy to which he turned for consolation in the face of death contains few explicitly Christian elements, and even its compatibility with Christian doctrine might be questioned. Such a paradox has provoked many hypotheses. Remember, C.S. Lewis's theory here, and this is just the transition period. His theory is that medieval culture was engaged, it by definition, what it was the working out of a project of organizing and systematizing truths in written form that were perceived that way from many different cultural sources. So, what do we make of the paradox of this guy? Many hypotheses. One, his Christianity was superficial and failed him when brought to the test, so that he had to fall back on the Neoplatonism and what it could do for him. That's one theory. Two, that his Christianity was solid as a rock and his Neoplatonism a mere game with which he distracted himself in his dungeon, as other prisoners in like cases have tamed a spider or a rat. It's an idea. Three, that the theological essays were not really written by the same man. Okay, there's a theory. None of these theories seem to me necessary. Okay. Remember, he's thinking a lot like medieval himself. It's like, when do we need to posit another entity for our hypothesis? Let's use Occam's razor. Do we really need any theories like this to make sense of it? Though the De Consolatione was certainly written after his fall in exile and perhaps under arrest, I do not think it was written in a dungeon or in daily expectation of the executioner. Once, indeed, he speaks of terror. Once, he describes himself as doomed to death and prescription. Once, Philosophia accuses him of fearing the bludgeon and the axe. Those three things are in the text, but the general tone of the book does not match these momentary outbursts. It is not that of a prisoner waiting death, but that of a noble and a statesman lamenting his fall, exiled, financially damaged, parted from his beautiful library, stripped of his official dignities, his name scandalously traduced. This is not the language of the condemned cell. And some, unquote. So, and some of the consolations which Philosophia addresses to him would be comically cruel mockeries to a man in that situation, as when she reminds him that the place which is exiled to him is home to others, or that many would regard as wealth, even those remains of his property which he has managed to save. The consolation Boethius seeks is not for death, but for ruin. When he wrote the book, he may have known that his life was in some danger. I do not think he despaired of it. Indeed, the complaints at the outset that death cruelly neglects wretches who would gladly die. Okay? Eh, you're cruelly rejecting a wretch who would gladly die. It's like, okay, so he's not even fearing death. It's more like, oh, they took all my money and I used to have an honorable, happy life, and now it's all ruined. Okay. If we had asked Boethius why this book contained philosophical rather than religious consolations, I do not doubt that he would have answered, but did you not read my title? I wrote philosophically, not religiously. Right. So C.S. Lewis is saying it in the author's mind, he thinks he's doing philosophy when he writes this book, because I had chosen the consolations of philosophy, not those of religion, as my subject. Right. I'm trying to. What do you mean? Everything I write has to be religious? I'm the point of the book is that. You might as well ask why a book on arithmetic does not use geometrical methods, right? So everybody's like, wait a minute, how can he be so religiously Christian and then have all of this Neoplatonic ideas in this later book of his? He goes, I'm doing philosophy over here. I can be a Christian and do philosophy. Aristotle had impressed on all who followed him the distinction between disciplines and the propriety of following in each its appropriate method. That's true. We've seen that in our excerpts in class 7, didn't we? The optician is studying the way light bends. The mathematician he's relying upon ideas from the mathematician, right? It's going up. The mathematician's relying on ideas of the logician. Just take the axioms from the level above you, utilize them, and don't ask questions about them, because then you'll be doing a different subject. Aristotle had impressed on all who had followed the distinction of the disciplines of propriety, following each of its appropriate method. We have seen this at work in Calcitus, and Boethius draws our attention to it in his argument. He compliments Philosophia on having used inborn and domestical proofs, not reasons fetched from without. We've seen this distinction, right? So he's saying explicitly in his book, he's saying, let's do philosophy, just like Aquinas is saying. We've got the scriptures, that's worth doing. Let some people do that. I want to make arguments based on reason and that alone, because that's what philosophy does. It has to be based on human reason. He's not saying other stuff isn't worth doing, and neither is Boethius. He's just saying that's what we're going to do in this work. He compliments Philosophia on having used inborn and domestical proofs rather than things fetched from without and borrowed that way. That is, he congratulates himself on having reached conclusions acceptable to Christianity from purely philosophical premises, as the rules of art demanded. Let's see what we get out of this book. Is this a proto Summa Theologica? When, on the other hand, she draws near the doctrines of hell and purgatory, he makes her check herself, for it is not now our business to discuss such matters. Okay, policing the work to say we're not talking about spiritual stuff. So maybe that's a quote from the text that supports this idea, although clearly these medievals had the idea that they could do philosophy about angels and demons as well. So we'll have to look at that citation and see if that really means what C.S. Lewis is saying it means here. But yeah, lots of evidence that he's meaning to do philosophy. And so his answer is he's just a Christian doing philosophy. He's allowed to borrow from Platonism in the medieval perspective. In fact, that's the task. But why, we may ask, did a Christian author impose upon himself this limitation? Partly, no doubt, because he knew where his true talent lay. But we can suggest another and probably less conscious motive. The distinction between Christian and pagan can hardly at that moment have been more vividly present to his emotions than that between Roman and barbarian, especially since the barbarian was also a heretic. Catholic, Christendom, and the high pagan past to which he felt so deep a loyalty were united in his outcry by their common contrast to Theodoric and his huge fair-skinned beer-drinking, boasting thanes. This was no time for stressing whatever divided from the Virgil, Seneca, Plato, and the old Republican heroes. He would have been robbed of half his comfort if he had chosen a theme which forced him to point out where the great ancient masters had been wrong. He preferred one that enabled him to feel how nearly they had been right, to think of them not as they, but as we. Okay. So if he's going to do theology and look at Neoplatonism, he has to say, oh, here's all the differences and why this idea is correct and that one's wrong. But if he's doing philosophy, he can say, look at this. We're all getting to the same thing here. And I'm not whitewashing any difference, but I'm not concerned with the spiritual stuff exactly. I'm looking at the intellectually based. I don't want, well, I shouldn't say spiritual because the philosophers are concerned with the spiritual. I'm not concerned with the religious concepts. I'm concerned with the intellectual ones. And look at these ideas. These are we're getting at something here. Okay, that's a pretty good argument, I would say. We need to read this book though. As a result, the specifically Christian passages in the book are few. The martyrs are clearly referred to in contradiction to the Platonic view that the divine and the human cannot meet except through a tertium quid. Prayer is a direct commercium between God and man. When Philosophia, speaking of providence, uses the word strongly and sweetly from wisdom, Boethius replies, I am delighted with your argument, but much more by the very language you use. But far more often, Boethius is saying what Plato or the Neoplatonists would have confirmed. Man, by his reason, is a divine animal. The soul is fetched from heaven, and her ascent thither is a return. In this account of creation, Boethius is much closer to Timaeus than to Scripture. Apart from its contributions to the model de consolatione, had some formal influence. It belongs to the kind called satira menipia, in which prose sections alternate with shorter sections in verse. Cool. From Boethius, this descends to Bernardus and Alanus, and even into Sanazaro's Alcadia. I have often wondered that it has ever been revived, or that has never been revived. One would have thought that a Landor or Newman or an Arnold might have turned it to good account. In Book One, the appearance of Philosophia as a woman, both old and young, is borrowed from Claudian's Natura in the consulship of Stilicho. It will reappear in the Natura of the French poem, which Lydgate translated as reason and sensuality. She tells him, among other things, that we philosophers, must anticipate calumny, for it is our express purpose, the maxime propositum, to displease the rabble. This towering vaunt, this philosophic panache, which goes beyond mere indifference to mud flinging and actually courts it, is of cynic origin. Milton's Christ is inflicted with it when he describes the common herd as people, quote, of whom to be dispraised were no small praise. In Paradise Regained, but poor Boethius is not yet ready for so high a strain. He is as deaf to it as a donkey to a harp. An image Chaucer appropriated in Triolus. Everyone is now slandering him, though in reality his conduct while in office had been of flawless purity. He adds with almost comic inconsistency, Boethius, the author here ruthlessly exposing Boethius, the natural man, that his virtue was all the more admirable because he practiced it with no thought of being admired. For, he adds, virtue is tarnished if a man displays it so as to get credit for it. This modest maxim cuts right across the ideals of the Dark Ages and of the Renaissance. Roland unashamedly desires los as Beowulf desires dom, or the heroes in French tragedy desire la gloire. It was often discussed in the later Middle Ages. Alanus knows knows it, but agrees with it only up to a point. The good man should not make fame his object, but to reject it altogether is too austere. We saw this exact debate happening with Numa in our reading last night. We see it all over. Maybe I should shut off the stream and just go read these things on my own without doing it in front of other people. I'd like to do it with other people. So there's a link there if you want to come on and be a part of the conversation. Right now we're doing this reading, but come on and interject and have a conversation with us. That would be more than welcome, I promise you. The good man should not make fame his object to austere. Gower, on the other hand, applies it in its full rigor, even to knightly deeds. In arms, lith non advance. To him that thanketh his name avance, to be renowned of his deed. It takes away from the glory of your deed that you wanted people to know about it. Boethius then passionately demands an explanation of the contrast between the regularity with which God governs the rest of nature and the irregularity he permits in human affairs. This is made of a central theme of nature's complaint. In Alanus, and of her confession in Jean de Meung. Later still, Milton is recalling and no doubt no doubt expects us to recognize that he is recalling this place from Boethius in one of the choruses of Samson. The whole concept will seem less remote to some modern readers if they relate it to the existentialist position that man is a passion inutile and compare very favorably with the irrational or even the inorganic world. Get this itch. With book two, we embark on that great apologia. You can see how much C.S. Lewis likes this book, even on a personal level, even more than the three previous sources. With book two, we embark on that great apologia for fortune, which impressed her figure so firmly on the imagination of succeeding ages. Comments on good and bad luck and their obvious failure to correspond with good and ill desert may be expected in any period, but the medieval allusions to fortune and her wheel are exceptional in their frequency and seriousness. The grandeur which this image takes on in the Inferno is a reminder of how entirely it depends on individual genius whether a locus communis shall or shall not be what we call commonplace. And this, like a thousand inferior passages, is part of the Bothian legacy. All right. No one who had read the Fortuna as he treats her could forget her for long. His work here, Stoical and Christian alike, in full harmony with the book of Job and with certain dominical sayings, is one of the most vigorous defenses ever written against the view common to vulgar pagans and vulgar Christians alike, which comforts cruel man by interpreting variations of human prosperity as divine rewards and punishments, or at least wishing that they were. It is an enemy hard to kill, latent in what has been called the Whig interpretation of history and rampant in the historical philosophy of Carlyle. At every point in this discussion, we meet old friends, that is, images and phrases which first became our friends when they had grown very much older. Thus, from book two, the most miserable misfortune is to have been happy once. For those who are just joining, we're reading C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image to try to understand the way the medievals thought, to aid us in our class on Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica, which we're reading through. And it's also being quite enlightening for us as we've been reading through Plutarch's Lives as well to notice how much the classics, the ancients and the medievals were alike to one another and how much they were thinking and aiming at the same things. Not to whitewash differences there. Um, and the reason why I said that, so let's pause for a moment on this quotation. So this poor sufferer who's lost his kingdom and is about to be executed is writing this book, And C.S. Lewis clearly loves this book, and he's recommended it so thoroughly that of the sources we've read in this chapter, I think this is now on my list of something I'm going to have to definitely read. And he says that it will aid us in understanding how the medievals thought. What C.S. Lewis does to try to understand how the medievals thought is he looks at the poetry that the layman resonated with to say these are the concepts that made sense and these are the thinking processes that make sense. Let's look at this one piece of wisdom from this text. The most miserable misfortune is to have been happy once. There's a group of philosophers who are hedonists. So, hedonists are people who believe that pleasure is the only thing worth living for. It's the only end that we seek as an end in itself and not as a means to anything else. So, the purpose of life is pleasure and to maximize pleasure. But these are very sophisticated hedonists. There's a group of hedonists inside. So, I said there's hedonists, but there's a group who happen to be hedonists whose central tenet is something like this: don't expose yourself to new pleasures. The point is to maximize pleasure. If you've never eaten lobster before, don't have lobster. So these are hedonists who avoid introducing themselves to new pleasures. If you're a virgin, don't have sex. It's a strange thing for a hedonist to say. But what they say is, look, the point is to minimize pain and maximize pleasure. If you discover that you really love lobster, and then you find in the future that there are plenty of opportunities that you don't have for lobster, and times when you wish to have lobster, but you just can't get it, you're going to have a net greater amount of pain than pleasure in your life. So, wherever you are now with your exposures to pleasures, stop there and just maximize your life with whatever those things are, and avoid and work hard to not come across new types of pleasures. So, I'm not endorsing that view, I'm just saying that happens to exist. One of the things I like to collect are ironic and, surprising philosophical camps, and that happens to be one in my collection. Anyway, Dante's Nessun Maggior Dolore in the Inferno and Tennyson's Sorrow's Crown of Sorrows leap to mind. Nothing is miserable unless you think it so. We remember Chaucer's "No man is wretched, but himself it ween" in the Ballad of Fortune, and Hamlet's "There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." Yeah, sorry, C.S. Lewis, that's the only one that came unbidden to my mind. But you happen to know everything else, and so it all pops into your head. We need to become better read. We are told that we cannot lose external goods because we never really had them. The beauty of fields or gems is a real good, but it is theirs, not ours. The beauty of clothes is either theirs, the richness of the stuff, or the skill of the tailor. Nothing will make it ours. The idea will turn up again unexpectedly in Joseph Andrews. Soon after this, we hear the praise of the prior atas, the primeval innocence pictured by the Stoics. Readers of Milton will here notice the pretiosa pericula, which became his precious bane. From this prior atas came both the former age of Chaucer's ballad and the old age mentioned by Orsino, Twelfth Night. We are told that nothing so much beguiles those who have some natural excellence but are not yet perfected in virtue as the desire for fame. It is a maxim from the Agricola of Tacitus. It will later blossom into Milton's line about that last infirmity of noble mind, right? The final sickness that has to be defeated is the desire that people should notice how great you've become as you've shed all the other vices. Again, I'm convicted. We shouldn't be live streaming our studies. We should just go do it alone and not have any of you know. But you're all welcome to join. That'll be my excuse. My excuse for my obvious vice that I'm depicting here from the medieval demand that we achieve a virtue that's much higher than what I'm capable of right now is that there's a link. Come and join us in all of our readings and studies and our conversations. And but we're reading books that knock us in the gut, and I feel it. If I were a good enough person to sit and do this silently, which I've done before, but if I was to do that, that would be better. I'd be a more virtuous person. Philosophia proceeds, according to this perspective at least, which seems to have more than a little truth to it. Philosophia proceeds to mortify this desire, as Africanus had done in the Somnium, by pointing out how provincial all earthly fame is, since this globe, by cosmic standards, don't hit the like and subscribe button. I like saying that often anyway, but don't hit the like and don't hit the subscribe button. Is admittedly to be regarded as a mathematical point. Puncti habere rationem. It's like, okay. But Boethius deepens this stock argument by stressing the diversity of moral standards even within this tiny area. What is fame in one nation can be infamy in another. And anyway, how short lived all reputations are. Books, like their author, are mortal. No one now knows where the bones of Fabricius lie. Here, for the benefit of his English readers, Alfred happily substituted the bones of Wieland. Okay, again, he was tracing it through literary sources later. Adversity has the merit of opening our eyes by showing which of our friends are true and which are fiend. Combine this with Vincent of Bavaria's statement that hyena's gall restores the sight, and you have the key to Chaucer's cryptic line, "The nateth nat the gall of noon hyene." A friend in times of trouble, you can find out who your real friends are. Also, knowing this medical concept that a hyena's gall restores sight, so you can tell the difference between things when you've got sight, so you can see which are your true friends and which are the fake ones. The needeth gnat the gall of noon hyene. Something you might say when Lear is mad. From book 3, all men know the true good is happiness, and all men seek it, but for the most part by wrong routes, like a drunk man who knows he has a house but can't find his way home. Chaucer reproduces the simile in the Knight's Tale. Yet even the false roots, such as wealth or glory, show that men have some inkling of the truth. For the true good is glorious like fame, and like wealth, self sufficient. So strong is the bent of nature that we thus struggle towards our native place, as the caged bird struggles to return to the woods. Chaucer borrows this image for his Squire's Tale. We will eventually be reading the Canterbury Tales. One of the false images of the good is nobility. But nobility is only the fame, and we have already exploded fame of our ancestors' virtue, which was a good of theirs, not ours. This doctrine had a flourishing progeny in the Middle Ages and become a popular subject for school debates. It underlies Dante's Canzone in the opening of Convivio and the other place in De Monarchia. The Roman Della Rosa goes beyond Boethius and boldly equates gentillesse with virtue. The English version at this point further expands its French original. The wife of Bath reproduces Boethius more exactly. Gower, like the Roman, identifies nobility with virtue set in the courage. One may be forgiven a smile when not otherwise very ignorant author finds in this passage a proof that Gower expresses the feeling of the middle class, which in his day was usual, rising into new importance. The argument now climbs to the position that the whole and perfect good, so that there's something to thank you for the insights, man. One may be forgiven a smile. So if you accidentally think that this is passage is proof that Gower expresses the feelings of the middle class, which in his day was, as usual, rising to new importance, when he says the virtue set in the courage, he's saying the exact opposite. The argument now climbs to the position that the whole and perfect good, of which we usually chase only fragments or shadows, is God. If the course of proving this, in the course of proving this, though it needed no new proof either for the Platonists or the Christians, Boethius slips in as axiomatic the remark that all perfect things are prior to all imperfect things. We've seen the argument in Aquinas already. It was common ground to nearly all ancient and medieval thinkers except the Epicureans. I have already stressed the radical difference which this involves between their thought and the development or evolutionary concepts of our own period, a difference which perhaps leaves no area and no level of consciousness unaffected. Yeah, the full impact of this is yet to permeate through my brain as I've been exposed to it. This is his most profound uh, cognitive distinction that's been brought up so far. I mean, the other ones were unbelievably profound. The fact that geocentrism is anthropoperiphery is super stunning. But um, the so if we just pause for a moment, we remember in Aquinas, one of his arguments had to do with the fact that everything I look at is caused by the thing before it. And it comes into actuality like a domino being knocked over to knock over the next domino. It comes into actuality from the potentiality that it has. So potentiality is prior to actuality. Mm. But like Aristotle, he can analyze the fact that everything in this realm, everything I can observe through my senses, has to be like that to even be conceptualized by me, to come to the conclusion that there must be something that is the opposite of that, because that can't go back forever in an infinite regress. You can't say, I've explained why this knocked over because this knocked into it, because this knocked into it is containing within itself the question, how did it knock into it? Well, because this knocked into it. And so that going back forever, there must be a prime mover. That's the Aristotelian move. That's the Aquinas move. But what that means, and he puts it very eloquently in the passage we just read in class 12, this is class 13, when we're not looking at that text right now, is actuality is actually prior to potentiality. The arche, the source of all being and action, goodness and truth and beauty and love of the Platonics, the divine, the prime mover has to be first, or none of this makes sense. It doesn't make sense to make sense of the world as domino hitting domino, unless there's a thing that is not like that. So, why did I get into that? Where does this the argument comes to the position of hold the perfect, the good. Okay, yeah. So this is prior. Those who have once risen to contemplate the admirable circle of the divine simplicity. I mean, otherwise you don't have explanation, which is fine. Maybe you don't have explanation, but so long with your science. Goodbye to all your science. Those who have once risen to contemplate the admirable circle of the divine simplicity must be careful not to look back again to worldly objects. The moral is enforced by the story of Orpheus and his fatal backward glance at Eury- Eurydice. And this telling of that story was as widely influential as Virgil's. It is also of great structural importance in the De Consolatione, the book we're looking at. For Boethius himself, when Philosophia visited him in Book One, was indulging in just such a retrospection. Here, too, he reaches his highest point as a poet in the famous lines Orpheus Eurydicean suum, vidit perditum, perdidit ascidit from book four. The doctor. All right, so what's the translation of that? One backward glance sufficed to see, to lose, to kill Eurydice. From book four, the doctrine of divine providence, Boethius complains rather aggravates than solves the real problem. Why is justice, certainly poetic justice, so unapparent in the course of events? Philosophia makes two replies. Okay? So we're still struggling with this. How come chance is affecting all? It's not fair. I was doing the right thing and bad things are happening to me. What does philosophy answer? It is all justice. The good are always rewarded and the wicked always punished. But the mere fact of being, by the mere fact of being what they are, Evil power and evil performance are the punishment of evil will, and it will be infinite since the soul is immortal. As philosophy, no less than theology, asserts. We're in agreement here. Philosophically, you can understand that's the truth, and theologically, through revelation, you can understand that's the truth. That's the truth, she says to him. The passage looks back to Virgil's hell, whose inhabitants ossi omnes imane nefas osuke potiti, all purposed dreadful deeds and got their way. Okay, very Platonic, right? Socrates is talking here. The disease of the soul, which is immortal and so goes on forever, is injustice. Cure yourself. Nothing you could do better with your time left on earth than try to get right with the divine. Try to untie the knots in your soul, figure out where that disease is and get rid of it. This is the Platonic attitude. This is the cynic attitude, not cynic in the way we mean it, but cynic in the sense of there's nothing else worth doing than sorting that out. I don't have much time. It looks forward to Milton, who says of the wiser pagans that to banish forever into a local hell, they thought not a punishment so proper and proportionate for God to inflict as to punish sin with sin. You get to just sort of live in that, and that's your punishment. So if you say, well, but the guy is stealing and getting away with stuff, that sucks for him. That sucks for him, not because eventually in a future world he'll be punished. Again, you see these very juvenile criticisms of heaven and hell that are on X and stuff. It's like, you're dying now. You're in hell now. Your soul is corrupt now. And it will be that way forever because the only, by definition, solution is to turn away from what you're doing. And you're not. You're sticking with it. So there you get to live. You get to live in the disease of the soul, and that is miserable. And yet, pleads Boethius, it is very strange to see the wicked flourishing and the virtuous afflicted. Why, yes, replies Philosophia, everything is strange until you know the cause. Compare the Squire's Tale. 2. That which in the citadel of the divine simplicity is providence, when seen from below, mirrored in the multiplicity of time and space, is destiny. And as in a wheel, the nearer we get to the center, the less motion we find. So every finite being, in proportion as he comes nearer to participating in the divine, the unmoving nature, becomes less subject to destiny, which is merely a moving image of eternal providence. Holy shit. Okay. I don't want to go off on. Look, we're not here to debate philosophy or theology. We're just trying to study the way the medievals thought about things. But holy mackerel. To know what that idea means, um, let me do this. Let me humbly submit to the judgment of people who are better equipped to make religious theological statements than I am. That when I can't believe this was just written this way. We're looking at philosophers trying to get to the ultimate truth here. But there's a lot of I don't wanna say too much about the religious revealed truths because I'm not the guy that should be talking about those things. But let me ask a question of any students of theology out there in an extra philosophical sense. As a philosopher, if someone were to posit that there is an eternal unchanging, can't die, immutable, and has relationship with me, then some of what it is there's an impression shaped relationship. Like it doesn't change, but it knows me. When Christ says, to know you is salvation, and that this is a great mystery. I believe that's in the scriptures, that this has been a great mystery. Are these classical philosophers getting at that idea? I'm going to just leave that as a question, a real question. I don't know. I'm not going to talk about what revealed truth means. That's not my realm. I'm asking though, those of you who know something about revelation, can it be that these philosophers are getting to the inevitability of a notion that, of course, that's how it is? How could it be any other way? Being qua being in relationship with you that cannot die and change means you are saved. Because how can you die if you are connected to that thing in that way? It's a question. It's just a question. But that's the idea philosophically that's being presented here. All right. So nature becomes less subject to destiny, which is merely a moving image of eternal providence. That providence is wholly good. We say that the wicked flourish and the innocent suffer, but we do not know who are the wicked and who are the innocent, still less what either need. All luck seen from the center is good and medicinal. The sort we call bad exercises good men and curbs bad ones. Okay, so this is an important principle from philosophy. This is quite a consolation. Not so in the clouds revelatory as what we were talking about a mere second ago. But okay, so there are people who say, "Look what happened to me. This happened to me. This happened to me. This. The reason why I'm like I am is because of these unjust and unfair things that happened to me." But we have all known people who have lived very pleasant, lucky, blessed, fortuitous lives who stub their toe and never get over it. And we've also heard stories of people who've had unbelievably, horribly rotten, I mean, candide depicted situations of mass murder and they're killing everyone in the village and I woke up being raped on a pile of dead bodies origin who go and do very noble things and say I won't let my soul be corrupted no matter what happens I'm aiming in the right direction. So when we're going to complain about luck and say well I don't deserve this I should have a better circumstance or how come that guy's getting away with so much, philosophy is saying you're thinking about it the wrong way. One of the consolations here is what happens to you reveals your character more than determines your character. Okay. The things that happen to you reveal what you are more than they make you be something. What you need to be concerned with is what you are and the nature of your soul and your virtue. You be concerned with that, and this becomes an indifference. Hey, I get to live a life with lots of luck. Hooray for that. Great. But am I being virtuous? Hey, I'm living a life with a lot of unjust misery, but that sucks. That sucks, but hey, am I being virtuous? That should be all that you're thinking of, she says to him. All luck, it's a hard thing to hear. I'm not saying that's an easy, that makes it easy. Now don't worry about it. But that's the message. All luck seen from the center is good and medicinal. The sort we call bad exercises good men and curbs bad ones, if they will take it so. Okay, so hey, even bad luck might make you rethink what you're doing if you need to. Thus, if only you are near the hub, if you participate in providence more and suffer destiny less, it lies in your own hands to make your fortune what you please. All right, we're going to stop trying to incorporate this into bigger pictures. Our purpose is to look at how he's thinking so we can understand how the medievals who resonated with his poetry were thinking. Or as Spencer turns this passage, each unto himself his life may fortuneize. So, yeah, you're stuck in the waters of an ocean of things that could just happen to you. But if you figure out how to become a solid ship, you can figure out how to navigate that course. So both are true at the same time. That's the model of the worldview that we're seeing emerge here. Okay. The noblest sentence of this passage, however, is not in words. And at Florence in Santa Maria del Popolo, the cupola above Chigos, above Kigi's temple, Kigi's tomb. It's hard. I'm trying to figure out if this is late Italian or early because the C would make it a hard, the H would make it a hard C. I don't know. Kigi's tomb sets the whole Bothian image of the wheel and the hub of destiny and providence before our eyes. What is that about? Oh, I know what that's about. Man, you go to the hospital for like a minute and it's just a lot of bills. I paid them and then they're like, "Oh, here's the estimate." It's like, "I paid you the money. I wanna not think about this." Okay. Sets the whole Bothian image of the wheel and the hub of destiny and providence before our eyes. On the utmost circumference, the planets, the dispensers of fate, are depicted. On a smaller circle, within and above them, are the intelligences that move them. At the center, with hands upraised in guidance, sits the unmoved mover. Okay, we've got our structure now. Noble assistant dispenser of his another words. So destiny and providence before our eyes on the utmost circumference of the planets. Okay, good. All right, we're gonna have to take this. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I guess I came down to pay too quickly, and the system doesn't expect that. This is very helpful information, and I'm very grateful for your help. May I ask you for a favor? The reason why it would be difficult to receive this information that I need to know that I've paid everything, right? I paid it all, but then that's an estimate. And we don't know what it's really going to be for sure. I can't have that mailed to me because meth heads have been stealing my mail for 6 months, and I don't actually have the ability to receive mail where I live. That's been dealt with, but what would be really useful is if you could put a note in my file that says, when we know for sure what he owes and we actually know if he owes us anything more than this, just give him a call. Would that be something you could do for me? You guys are like miracle workers. You have all the answers to everything. I really appreciate it. Th- I appreciate it. Thank you for the call today. That's really all I need. I don't need an itemized list. I just need to know that I've paid you everything so that I don't discover 2 years later collectors are after me. You know what I mean? If you could make a note and call me when you know it's not an estimate and it's actually the amount, that would be really helpful to me. Your name again? Thank you, Hannah. Thank you so much. That you don't understand how much that helps me to keep track of things. It's really, really a blessing. So thank you for making that note. Thank you for doing that for me. I really appreciate it. You have a good day. The systems we live in are so ridiculous. I mean, they gave me a Benadryl and they checked that I wasn't dying with a post-op antibiotic allergic reaction. Thank you for making sure I'm not dying. I appreciate that. Can you tell me what I owe you for a Benadryl? Like 500 bucks already. Like, all right. All right, we're almost done here. On the utmost circumference of the planets. Okay, we've read this, but this is very interesting. So we've got a place for destiny and for providence and for fate and the things that seem random now in this hierarchy of realms. I want to read that again. Hey, we'll read it again with Roger here. We're almost done, buddy. The noblest descendant of this passage, however, is not in words. At Florence, at Samaria, tomb of there's an image of the wheel, the hub of destiny. Okay, so it's not in tomb. So this isn't poetry. This is actually depicted. Okay, the whole Bothian image of the wheel and the hub of destiny and providence before our eyes on the utmost circumference of the planets. We should look this up. The dispensers of fate are depicted. On a smaller circle within and above them are the intelligences and move them. At the center, with hands upraised in guidance, sits the unmoved mover. Okay, so can we look this up? This would be a fun thing to see. Florence. Okay, we're gonna pull this up, see if Google Art Project has a picture of it. See if we can. Oh, holy mackerel! Is this what we're looking at? Okay, let's say share this tab. Okay, that's not going to help us to see these things dispensing things here. Hold on a moment. Let's see if we can get a better version here. I wonder if the Google Art Project. Okay. Yeah, we're looking at the cupola above. Florence and all right, let's see if we can find this. Ah, it'd be so much fun to walk through a 3D version of this. It would have been nice if I had done some prep for this class and then we wouldn't be searching it in real time. All right, let's finish our reading and we'll add this in later. Okay, so we've got the fates and we've got the hierarchy of all this that we've been understanding. Now, in the fifth and last book, the argument is closer, and succeeding generations were unable to pluck out of it many isolated plums. But this does not mean that it proved less influential. It underlies every later treatment of the problem of freedom. The conclusion of the previous book has left us with a new difficulty. If, as its doctrine of providence implies, God sees all things that are, were, or will be uno mentis in ictu, in a single act of mind, and thus foreknows my actions, how am I free to act otherwise than he has foreseen? Philosophia will not put Boethius off with this shift that Milton is reduced to in Paradise Lost, that though God foreknows, his foreknowledge does not cause my act. For the question never was whether foreknowledge necessitates the act, but whether it is not evidence that the act must have been necessary. Okay? You're not getting it out of it that easily, he says. Can there then be foreknowledge of the intermediate? Good question to ask Philosophia. How's he going to sort this out? In a sense, yes. The character of knowledge depends not on the nature of the object known, but on that of the knowing faculty. Thus, in ourselves, sensation, imagination, and ratio, all in their several ways know man. Yeah, you can predict what a person's going to do. So, yeah, you can have foreknowledge. God ought to also, right? Sensation knows him as a corporeal shape, imagination as a shape without matter, ratio as a concept, a species. None of these faculties by itself gives us the least hint of the mode of knowledge enjoyed by its superior. But above ratio or reason, there is a higher faculty. Can't believe we're getting into this so early. This is before 500 AD. What? What did we just discover? You Neoplatonists, it's not just a faculty of the mind, there's some spirit man behind it all. And that's necessary for some reasons, but we're not getting into the debate. We're just trying to see how they understood it. Intelligentsia or understanding. Long afterwards, Coleridge reversed this by making reason the higher and understanding the lower. I postpone further consideration of the medieval terminology till a later section. So we'll work that out later. But clearly there's this new idea. Just as we saw heaven and earth, now we've got to have this middle realm. Just like we saw nature and the cosmos isn't everything, because now that you've got the heaven, there's this emergence of a lady natura that you can actually see emerge. And this is at the very late of the ancient classical period, where they didn't even really have time to incorporate her that much into their mythology because she's stepping in as the medievals are taking over. Okay, I see that. It's good to have you here, Roger. If you type, we will say what you're saying since you can't use your camera and mic. I wanted to tell you you're on mute because you're on private. Okay, got it. Okay. Hey, I appreciate that, man. Thank you. Okay. So just like that, there's this birth of this new conception of like, okay, Plato had this idea, you got your appetite, you got your spirit, and you got your intellect. But now we've got the birth of something that is a faculty beyond the intellect. Reason cannot conceive the future being known except as it would have been known, if at all, by her. That is, as determinate, right? You can do the determination stuff that I referenced earlier. But that's not the same thing. But it is just possible, even for us, to climb up to the intelligential level and get a glimpse of the knowledge which does not involve determinism. Okay. We're not going to defend that. We're not arguing it. We're not doing philosophy. We're not doing theology. We're just describing accurately these concepts that are understood by the medievals and the classics. And here we're before 500 AD, this intermediate period. Eternity is quite distinct from perpetuity. They understand a difference between these ideas here. From mere endless continuance in time, that's perpetuity. Perpetuity is only the attainment of an endless series of moments, each lost as soon as it is attained. Eternity is the actual and timeless fruition of illimitable life without the limitation of the temporal upon it. Time, even endless time, is only an image, almost a parody of that plenitude. A hope, this is great because we're going to get into the eternality of God soon in Aquinas. A hopeless attempt to compensate for the transitoriness of its presence by infinitely multiplying them. That is why Shakespeare's Lucrece calls it thou ceaseless lackey to eternity. Time is the ceaseless lackey to eternity. And God is eternal, not perpetual. Strictly speaking, he never foresees. Thank you, Roger, by the way. I just realized you came onto the stream just to let me know that I was on mute. Appreciate that. Nice looking out. Thank you. God is eternal, not perpetual. Strictly speaking, he never foresees, simply sees. Your future is only an area, and only for us a special area of his infinite now. He sees, not remembers your yesterday's acts because yesterday is still there for him. He sees, not foresees your tomorrow's acts because he is already in tomorrow. Again, we're not doing theology or philosophy here. We're just noticing this is the idea that has emerged through this author. As a human spectator, by watching my present act, does not at all infringe its freedom. So I am nonetheless free to act as I choose in the future because God, in that future, his present, watches me acting. I have so ruthlessly condensed an argument of such importance, both historical and intrinsic, that the wise reader will go for it to the original. Yeah, we need to go to this original philosophical work by Boethius for sure. He's sold me. Of the four major works that we've looked at so far, this is next on our list that C.S. Lewis has talked to us about. This Boethius one, we're going to have to do this. And apparently, it will introduce us to the medieval way of thinking so much that we'll fall in love with it and become, he says, you can become a native of that land by reading this book. He never said that about the others at all. I cannot help thinking that Boethius has here expounded a Platonic conception more luminously than Plato ever did himself. Well, there's definitely a difference there. All right, we're not going to get into the philosophy stuff right now and all of that. We got plenty of space for that. But this is, it's not just it's not just a Platonic idea anymore, I think. Anyway, we'll have to debate that in another time and look at it more closely. The work ends with Philosophia thus speaking. There is no return to Boethius and his situation any more than to Christopher Sly at the end of The Taming of the Shrew. This I believe to be a stroke of calculated and wholly successful art. We are made to feel as if we had seen a heap of common materials so completely burnt up that there remains neither ash nor smoke nor even flame, only a quivering of invisible heat. Gibbon has expressed in cadences of habitual beauty his contempt for the importance of such philosophy to subdue the feelings of the human heart, but no one ever said it would have subdued Gibbon's. It sounds as if it had done something for Boethius. It is historically certain that for more than 1,000 years, many minds not contemptible found it nourishing. I can't wait to read it, to be honest with you. Found the sophisticated hedonists you mentioned quite earlier quite hilarious and ironic at a cosmic level, says Roger. If your nervous system falls in love with certain stimuli, you better ensure beforehand that it is not something scarce. Well, it will be. What their theory was is that it will be scarce. It will be too scarce for you to not have more pain than pleasure from your lack of ability to satisfy that new itch. And so their commitment is just as a rule, always, it's wiser and better and more virtuous if all you care about is pleasure as a hedonist to avoid introducing yourself to new forms of pleasure. With certain stimuli better in front is not something scarce and difficult to procure reliably, nor brings second order effects of suffering such as okay, yeah. They were sophisticated hedonists, and that's why we talked about them. Okay. Uh as the curiosity that they are. And yeah, you are. It's quite interesting. Okay. Before closing this chapter, it will be convenient to mention two authors who are later in time and very much inferior in rank. They are not, like those whom I have been describing, contributors to the model, but they sometimes supply the handiest evidence as to what it was. Both are encyclopedias. Isidore, Bishop of Seville, from 600 to 636, wrote the Etymology, as the title implies. His ostensible subject was language. But the frontier between explaining the meaning of words and describing the nature of things is easily violated. Okay, he's noticing that. Very careful observer, Lewis is. He makes hardly any effort to keep on the linguistic side of it. His book thus becomes an encyclopedia. This is what this word means. This is what this word means. But when he's saying this is what this word means, he's actually talking about the very nature of the thing itself. And so, look, this is more like an encyclopedia, he says. It is a work of very mediocre intelligence, but often gives us straight scraps of information we cannot easily run to ground in better authors. It also has the enormous advantage of being accessible to a good modern edition, in a good modern edition. The same, unhappily, is not true of Vincent of Bovias. His huge speculum majus is divided into the speculum naturale and speculum doctrinale and the speculum historiale. We might expect that the doctrinal mirror was concerned with theology. Actually, it deals with morals, arts, and trades. Okay, so he's talked about some works beyond that. Okay, we're done with that chapter. We are going to do another recording today, and we're going to keep reading this book because I'm very eager to get what we can get out of this book. Let's pause for a moment. I'll update the slides of everything that we have from what we read in the previous videos. And we remember what we're up to. We're just going to look at the first 5 of these. We're getting introduced to medieval and Renaissance literature through this book. We want to discover how the medievals thought about the cosmos to do 2 things: to help us to appreciate their literature by understanding what it meant to them, and so that we can understand how they thought through their literature. Look at the poetry, which had to rely upon metaphors and concepts. This is the method which would resonate with the average person who was literate, who liked the poetry and allowed it to catch on. The ancient and medievals all understood how to think scientific. All right, so we started to understand. We won't go into those things. We started to understand that what emerged out of all of this study is that the ancients understood physics and they understood cosmology as 2 different subjects, which they are. We pretend they're the same thing, and then we let silly scientists tell us how to interpret the facts. But the story and the history are 2 different things. Literature and history are 2 different things. Cosmology and astrophysics are 2 different things. They understood lots of things about astrophysics. The Earth is revolving around a greater source of light. It's a globe. The stars are globes too, and they dwarf the Earth in size. They knew all sorts of things astrophysically, and they referenced them in their poetry, and it's very clear that they understood these things, and that's fine. They also had a story that the Earth is like a disc with domes on top of it, or actually not a disc, a globe with domes around it in all 3 dimensions, domes of higher authority, that there are realms of incompatibility and then mediating realms between them. These are stories that put Earth at the center. And what we've noticed is that Earth at the center of a story like this is not so obvious as it seems to us. We think, oh, you're saying Earth is the most important thing. They're saying the exact opposite. They're saying in the version of the story, of the literature, of the cosmology of what we are, putting Earth at the center is putting it as close to hell and meaninglessness as possible. There's no better way to put it on the margin of the margin of the margin than to say it is far away from the eternal things that if you were there looking down, you would laugh at the silliness of everything that's concerned you in your lifetime. Yeah, what that's come up. Okay, so they had multiple ways of thinking. We're not as sophisticated as they are. As I've been saying in lots of other classes, and I'm so glad we got a chance to reread this book and we're going to keep rereading it. We are the retarded offspring of our ancestors who were much smarter than we were by far. And we need to start going back to them to understand what to actually think of things. Um, in any event, we've had some profound and dramatic revelations about the way the medievals and the Renaissance and the classical thinkers thought. This is a part of a complementary thing that we're doing inside of the Thomas Aquinas Summa Theologica class, where Roger gave us 4 hours and 45 minutes of reading excerpts of Aristotle that are basically copy pastings of what we had already read in Aquinas. Okay, so the connection, and the other thing that C.S. Lewis points out is uh, a pagan in the early centuries of this millennium and a Christian spiritualist and a pagan spiritualist were more like each other than either of them are like us. That's not to whitewash the differences and say they're the same thing. It's to say you don't understand either if you think that they were very, very different and we're in one of the camps. We are far away from either of their camps, and both of them are aiming at the same types of things. We've discovered the pagan spiritualists explicitly explicitly said Zeus and all these other deities are images like angels and daemons of the thing we're really after, which is so far beyond us and is one monotheistic triune God. They got to triunity in their philosophy apart from any consideration for Christian notions. So the Christians have a triune God. There's a different triune God. There's important distinctions theologically. We're not saying these are all the same thing, but they understood a trinity in the divinity that was necessary through their rationality and their philosophy, as well as through their mythology. All of this should be mind blowing to us, and we should just reread this book 4 times or go back and watch all the videos again where we're rereading the text. So, this is blowing my mind. This is way better than I remember it being. I knew it was good. I knew it had some of this in it, but this is blowing my mind. And it's giving us, I had AI go through the text. I don't know if it does it correctly. I hate AI, but I said, let's just get a list of all the citations. The list of citations is unbelievable. I think I posted them on X a while back. That alone is mind boggling. So if you want to get into medieval literature, if you want to do a literature class, you kind of have a syllabus here in this book, and you can just say, hey, I want to know all these poems and stories that C.S. Lewis is effortlessly quoting because they're arising in his mind unbidden as he's talking about these things, and they're proving points about the way the medievals thought. I would say of the first 4 chapters we've read, Boethius is on the list. I think we're gonna have to read him probably later because we've already done more classes on Aquinas, and we're gonna keep reading through the Summa Theologica, but we're gonna keep this going as a series of how did medieval man think about the cosmos, and looks like Boethius is not just enlightening on that front, like the other sources he uses, but C.S. Lewis says if you read it, you're probably going to fall in love with it. And if you read it, it's a ticket to becoming a citizen of the medievals. You can become naturalized, he says, and you can just think like them after this because it will change your citizenryship. It'll change your DNA and you'll just become one of them. So let's do it, baby. Let's read it and see what happens to us. Um, we're reading books that read us. Yes, Roger, it is, it's what C.S. Lewis is demonstrating is that there are intellectual, rational, ratio principles that force the medieval they're not just making stuff up, that force them to analyze the way things must be, that make it be that man is tripartite, that the state is tripartite, that the cosmos is tripartite, and that God himself is triune. Um, so they are all reflections of each other. And if God is the source of all creation, why shouldn't everything look like it in that sense also as well? That's maybe more of a Christian notion in philosophy, who knows? But yes, yeah, it mirrors it not just accidentally or not because we like things to mirror each other, but because there are thought processes that force us to the conclusion that it's that way, which are the same thought thinking principles. Yeah, the question was, is the Trinity a reflection of the tripartite soul of Plato? Yeah, absolutely, and And yeah, we can go back and watch the videos here where we're reading this. Please always read the question. Yeah, absolutely. That would be useful. So the question asked is the Trinity a reflection of the tripartite soul of Plato? It's not just a reflection of it, it's Platonic philosophical thinking applied to the soul, applied to the state, applied to the cosmos, applied to the divine. In other words, it's not like I'd like them all to look like each other. It's this is how we have to make sense of things that are incompatible. There must be a mediation between them. And if there is a distinction, is that distinction a real distinction? So by applying that way of thinking, which we're not adopting, endorsing, or criticizing, we're just describing here, you end up with that understanding. So they either discovered that God was triune or they imposed it upon him. We're not going to have that debate here. We're going to say as we try to understand the way the medievals thought, they discovered it. There's an intellectual process of discovery where they came to understand it was true and had reasons why. We have to engage with that. We can't say, "Oh, here's a foreign alien people and they have a religion. Here's some artifacts of their religion." This is philosophy, first of all, that they're doing to get to these ideas. Now, the philosophy of Plato is steeped in poeticism, not in a pejorative sense, but he's using poetry to try to point at things that he's saying explicitly we can't just understand with propositional language. So that makes it nice and complicated in a good way. But it is still philosophy that's being done there. And so, yeah, they discovered the triune nature of the divine. And there's a very small, but perhaps very deep difference between the Christian and the Platonic Trinity that is not something that theologians could wash over. And we're not trying to say they're all the same and wash over them. And we're not trying to make a big deal about the distinctions right now either, although there will be plenty of time to be doing that as we get into the philosophy of Aquinas. Because to say Aquinas is copy pasting Aristotle or Plato or other things in different passages is not quite fair. This is an ongoing conversation. That would be like saying, Einstein was copy pasting Newton because he was just describing gravity. It's like, no, we're trying to revise and get closer to things. And maybe we're failing and maybe we're succeeding, but the debate is ongoing. And so this is what we're discovering. And we're discovering how rich it was and how far back it goes. These sophisticated ideas, we got through the chapter on the classics. This is just the intermediary period where the medievals are going to start emerging, and you've got these Platonists and these Christian spiritualists, these Neoplatonic spiritualists and Christian spiritualists who look so much like each other that the first two sources we looked at, we had to spend a long time saying there's a lot of debate about whether or not this guy was a Christian or a pagan. And the same thing with the next one. And C.S. Lewis gives his opinion, but hard to parse out. So, in any event, that ends the recording now. And what we're going to probably do is no, what we're definitely going to do is come back and continue with chapter 5, because I think that this is one heck of a source to complement our Aquinas class on trying to understand the way the medievals thought. So we'll have a parting sip and then we'll have a simultaneous one when we start the next video in about 10 or 15 minutes, probably 10. Go. Thank you, Roger. Peace, everybody. We'll see you soon.